The Silver Mist Forest by Levi Athens. Deep within the mountainous valleys of my home state, I found a strange forest called the Silver Mist Forest, but no one can ever go there. I stumbled upon it one evening while hiking through the wilderness back in 1998. I wandered off the typical hiking trail while in the adventuring mood, and had gotten all but lost in the dense pine trees when I saw an old wooden sign which read, "The Silver Mist Forest." Cautiously, I journeyed further into the woods. I had with me a compass and one of those old emergency satellite phones in case I really needed to call for help. I headed east and kept walking, traversing the rough terrain. I must have been caught up in my own mind or some kind of daze because, for whatever reason, I just kept walking and walking without realizing how far I'd gone. A bizarre atmosphere loomed over me as I kept walking deeper into this troubling environment. Before long, it was getting dark, and a thick fog was rolling in from a nearby hollow. The fog scattered across the mountain, obscuring the places in between each tree and turning it into a maze of obstacles. An odd feeling lingered in my mind. Maybe it was paranoia, but I swear I kept hearing something behind me, stepping with my every step. I didn't expect to be there in the dark. I trekked onward, aided only by a small keychain flashlight from my car keys. Then the footsteps got louder and faster. I looked behind me, peering through the cloud of fog, but I couldn't see a thing. By this time, I decided it was a good idea to head back. I turned around going west, but the noises still seemed to follow me. Every shadow and shape in my path seemed a potential danger as paranoia gripped me. The darkness echoed in its blank and hollow emptiness at me in waves. My imagination then decided to mess with me. The idea that perhaps a bear or some other animal was the cause of these noises entered my mind, and once it was there, I couldn't shake it. The footfalls seemed to grow closer, and my sense of danger heightened. In sudden panic, I made the mistake of running. In a full sprint, I took off, passing through the mist and dodging the trees. Embarrassing as it is to admit, I was genuinely in fear for my life. Something about this place really had a hold on my psyche. Then, when maneuvering through the narrow space between two scraggly trees, a jutted-out branch caught me and sent me veering into the side and falling back. I lost my balance completely and fell hard on the forest floor. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath and looking up into the sky beyond the tall trees as the natural light faded. If something was coming for me, I was as good as dead. But to my surprise, the noise was gone. I wondered, did I outrun it? Was it all in my head? I sat up and tried to reorient myself, but when I looked at my compass, something was wrong. The needle on the compass was spinning around and around like crazy. Did I break it in the fall, or was something affecting it? Luckily, I was able to follow some nearby power lines back to safety. As I came closer to the main trail, my compass oddly started working again. I made my way back to my car just as the stars came out to redecorate the night sky. As I drove off, I saw an unusual light in the sky. It wasn't a plane or anything like that. Still not sure what it was, but it shined an eerie purple glow. I hesitated to call it an unidentified flying object, but that description certainly fits. At this point, I just wanted to get home. That night, I hardly got any sleep. I just kept thinking about my experience. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the pine trees of the Silver Mist Forest, the fog rolling in or the treetops extending out into the open skies. I'd hear the ominous sound of something approaching or see the bright glowing purple light in the sky. That night I dreamed of running through the darkened forest, of weaving between the tall trees in a hurried attempt to get away. But what was chasing me, I wondered. The dream had felt so real. I could feel the forest floor, the fresh night air, hear the crickets, and sense the danger of something approaching. What was I running from? I needed to go back there. Something was pulling me back. It was like a piece of me was still there. This time, however, I'd go in the morning. This time, I'd be prepared to see something strange. I made my way towards the main hiking trail, driving my usual route with the tall pine trees scraping the sky either side of the road. Suddenly something stirred in a nearby bush. A dark, hairy mass appeared from the foliage and darted its way onto the road ahead. In an instant, I slammed on my brakes to narrowly avoid hitting it. There stood a human-like figure, completely covered in hair. Before I could get a good look at it, the creature ran off. It disappeared into the thick wilderness, never to return again. The heck did I just see? I sat there in the middle of the road for a while, shocked and dumbfounded by what had just happened. Maybe it's hubris, foolhardiness, or something that came over me, but I kept driving. It would only get weirder from here. I looked down at my watch. Inexplicably, it had stopped. I parked my car at the trail entrance and began the trek into the woods. I entered into the Silver Mist Forest, traveling across tough terrain once more and heading east in the direction of the sunrise. The forest felt alive and active, as if every tree was conscious of my presence. It felt even stranger than before. The environment seemed to hum with electricity. The atmosphere surrounded me and clung to me like a blanket. The air was thick, hardly breathable. Again, the fog rolled in, covering everything in an impenetrable haze. A man stepped forward from the mist. Startled, I jumped back. He was wearing a green Forest Ranger uniform and identifying patches on his shoulders and the front pocket. "What are you doing out here? You're not allowed to be this far off the trail." "Oh, sorry. I was just looking around," said nervously. I thought about telling him about the strange thing that ran out in front of my car, but he seemed like a no-nonsense kind of guy. "I'm gonna need you to turn around and head back to the main trail now," he said, giving me a stern look. Something didn't feel quite right about this guy. His voice almost sounded unnatural, like a stage performer delivering a line. It was only then that I noticed his name tag was blank and that one of the patches on his shoulders was upside down. His gaze harshened, as if he had noticed that I noticed. "Turn around and go to your vehicle." Despite my suspicions of the man, I followed his orders to avoid getting in any trouble. Yes, sir," I replied and began to turn around. As I was walking towards the entrance, I heard him say, "Remember, you didn't see anything. Understood?" I looked back over my shoulder and saw the man had vanished into thin air. It wasn't just the fog that had covered him up. He disappeared entirely before my eyes. I kept walking back to my car. I knew that something was very strange and seriously wrong about this forest. Either this place was messing with my mind or the strangest of beings had claimed it as their own. As I walked further and further away, my mind seemed to clear more and more. There's no way that just happened. I must have imagined it. There's no way, I told myself. I had to be sure. I began walking back towards where the man had been, but as soon as I took a few steps, a figure began appearing from the mist. It was a frightening specter in the shape of a wolf. The creature's eyes shined an eerie diamond brilliance, and its body gleamed a bright silver. This bizarre figure was no ordinary animal. The wolf began to speak in a haunting and uncanny human voice without ever moving its lips. It whispered. The silver wolf took a step forward. I stood frozen for a moment with panic growing within me. It said again, increasing in volume. I could hear the sound of it speaking both in my mind and in my ears. The specter walked towards me again. I got the most intense feeling of fight or flight I'd ever gotten in my life. I took off running as fast as I could all the way back to the main trail. A primal and animalistic need to escape consumed me. I scrambled to the sanctuary of my vehicle and got in. I hurriedly pulled the door closed. As I drove off from the trail entrance, I saw something lift up from beyond the pine trees. It was much larger than any bird, a man-sized winged beast. The giant bird glided effortlessly through the sky. It moved with all the ease of a fish swimming through the water. Its wingspan was massive, As it swooped lower, I saw that it had light gray skin and glowing red eyes. It scowled down at me. The creature began to follow my vehicle as I drove, as if seeing me off and making sure that I was leaving. It circled above a few times and then flew off, vanishing out of sight. I drove away at full speed and went straight home. I never went back there again, but to this day I routinely think about that forest. I still see that place in my dreams at night. I asked around to my friends to see if they've ever heard of the Silver Mist Forest, and to my surprise, some of them had stories. They told of whispery voices and singing that led them out of the forest. They told of unearthly glowing objects and flashes of light out of nowhere. They said electronics would mysteriously stop working, as if they were in some sort of interference. One of my friends said that they'd been hiking through there and suddenly she got that odd feeling that she had to leave. The theme repeated in all their stories, the thought randomly popping into their heads that they had to get out of there. It was as if the forest had its own way of keeping you out or letting you know that you shouldn't be there. Another friend of mine told me he'd gone camping there only to wake up with his tent back on the main trail. The Silver Mist Forest is the strangest place I've ever been to. The word haunted doesn't cut it. It's a mystery that pulls you in, but turns you away before you can understand it. It shines in the distance of our knowledge, but fades from sight when we approach. It's a place off limits to the reality that human beings are allowed to go. The reason I felt compelled to tell you about this decades later is that a few days ago I saw a news story about that area. It said that a massive fire had ripped through the forest, burning away everything in sight. I don't have to worry about some idiot like me reading this story and heading out there now. That's the end of the Silver Mist Forest. Whatever was there has taken its secrets with it. However, it's not the only place out there like this. I know it's not the only place. You should be aware of that. There are places on this earth where monsters roam, where unexplained lights glow in the night sky, and where people and animals aren't quite what they seem. You just have to know where to look, and sometimes, if you're like me, you'll find it by accident. Forest of Three by Cedarlight. The Forest of Three. That's what it's called. Nobody knows who named it or when. In fact, this secluded area is not labeled on maps. It has no official name, only the name given to it by the townsfolk who live on its edge. The Forest of Three. Perhaps it's named after the three tall redwoods that grow in its heart. Three towering giants, lifting their heads above the tree line. They stand in a circle with overgrown branches extended into each other's foliage, as if linking arms. When the wind howls, one can see them sway, their powerful roots supplying the great forces needed to prevent them from falling. Viewed from the correct angle, it can appear as if they were attempting to dance, to uproot themselves and skip in a circle with hands joined. The three redwoods have been left untouched for decades. Although the ancient, well-seasoned wood would surely be profitable for the town's lumber industry, not a single person has ever suggested cutting them down. The redwoods were viewed by the townsfolk as guardians of the forest, as protectors of the town. And a very small town it is. How many inhabitants are there? Nobody knows the exact count, for such details are of little concern, but it could not be more than a few hundred. During daylight hours, the streets are occasionally filled with lively sounds of children playing, running, skipping, shouting, and all other manner of things that children are prone to do. However, the town itself is a rather boring place, and not the preferred playground of children. After all, the town sits next to a large forest. What better playground could a child ask for? Thousands of trees to climb, rocks to overturn, creatures and insects to be examined. A child could spend every day exploring the vast expanse of the green, and never happen upon the same tree twice. Yes, the forest is a perfect place for children. A place for them to explore, to imagine, to learn. The children love the forest greatly. They even sing a nursery rhyme about it, skipping in circles with hands joined. Children will chant, come play in the forest of three, you with I and I with thee. Oh, such fun we have in store, lurking there forevermore. Where this rhyme comes from, nobody knows. It is possible that the children themselves wrote it. Yet, upon examination, the theory seems implausible. Forevermore? Thee? Hardly words that children would understand, let alone include in song. No, this rhyme speaks of something old, something archaic, something beyond the understanding of children. For many years, life was peaceful in the small town. Nothing noteworthy occurred. There was no newspaper because there was never any news. A simple lumber town, with a simple lumber industry, populated by simple people. Everything was as it should be. Nothing was out of place. Then, a child disappeared. How long ago was this? Few remember the exact year, several decades ago at least. A child whose only concern in life was sweets and playtime simply vanished. A town meeting was called. One of the other children claimed they had seen the missing child earlier that day, that the missing child had gone into the forest to play, as usual, and had not come back. The search party was immediately organized and sent into the forest. They searched for hours, until the falling darkness did not permit them to search any longer. We'll search at first light. Everything will be fine. It's probably just a game. Don't worry so much. The townsfolk comforted the child's terrified parents. As soon as the first rays of sunlight crept through the trees, the search party was out again. They covered miles and miles, hardly stopping for rest or food. Yet there was no trace of the missing child. Each day they searched, and each day they came back with sore feet, hungry bellies, and no child. Hope was still there, but it was quickly fading. Each day the search party came back sooner and sooner. Each day they spent less and less time looking for the missing child before heading back. Eventually the searches ceased entirely. If one were to examine the town at that time, at first glance it would appear just as it had before. Men chopped wood, stores had good business, school was in session. Children still played in the streets and in the forest. Of course, the family and friends of the missing child grieved, but nothing would seem out of the ordinary. At first glance. Look closer and you would see it. The children, they played, they danced, they sang their nursery rhyme. Yet there was something odd about their games. As they skipped in circles, arms together, chanting their favorite tune, there was a distinct gap. Where two children should have been holding hands, they instead held their arms to the side, creating a gap in the circle. A gap that seemed just large enough to make room for another child. During the rainy season, the children often had to play inside. The school had an ample supply of checkerboards, which were excellent at keeping the children's minds engaged. If one looked closely at the children playing checkers, you would notice a single lonely child. Whereas all the other children had partners to play with, this child was on their own. Nevertheless, they seemed to be having a fine time, making moves for both sides of the board, and even becoming angry when they lost to their imaginary partner. Life in the town continued. The memory of the missing child faded with each year, until the other children scarcely remembered them. Soon, the children matured and had children of their own. The unfortunate unsolved mystery of the child that went missing was slowly forgotten, until a second child vanished. The adults who remembered the original disappearance were disturbed. The disappearance of another child brought back painful memories. Many of them had been children themselves when the first child went missing, although they remembered very little about that child. Again, a town meeting was called. During the meeting, it surfaced that the child was last seen heading into the forest, eager to play, and again, a search party was formed. This search party fared no better than the one 15 years earlier. Although the forest was searched each day for hours, with many, many miles of land being covered, not a single trace of the child was ever found. Again, the search party was disbanded, leaving the family to grieve their loss. After a while, the town seemed to return to normal. Daily life resumed to its normal course, just as so many years ago. Yet, if one looked closely at the children, you would notice the same curiosities witnessed 15 years ago. The children skipped in circles, singing the nursery rhyme that their parents had passed on to them. But again, there was a gap in their group, a void that was only apparent when they danced. The gap appeared to be just a bit larger than the one before. Perhaps there was now room for 2 extra children to join in their happy group. During rainy days, when the children were stuck indoors with worn-out checker sets, there were no longer any lonely children. Every child had a partner to play with. However, laying unnoticed in the corner of the room, there was a solitary checker set. It had no players, no children to have fun with it. The pieces were scattered across the board as if the game were currently in progress. Yet, there was nobody causing it. Who can say what this meant? Maybe nothing. Children are prone to strange behavior, as any parent knows. A gap in their dancing circle, an unused checkerboard. Why should any of these anomalies be cause for concern? In the end, it did not matter. No adult noticed the slightly unusual behavior of the children after either disappearance. Such was life in the small lumber town. Years continued to pass. Those who were children during the first disappearance became middle-aged. The friends of the second child who disappeared now had children of their own, and life passed by, completely normal, until tonight. For tonight is a very special night. If one were to visit the town center, you would find it bustling with activity. Worried faces, loud arguments, and weeping family is what you would find. You see, earlier today, a child went into the forest to play and did not return. A town meeting was called to discuss the best course of action. Many members of the town remember the initial disappearance, which occurred more than 3 decades ago. Some are saying that the disappearances are connected, that 2 disappearances could be coincidence, but not 3. Some now believe that the forest is haunted, while others call them crazy. Early tomorrow morning, when the sun begins to rise, a search party will set out to find the missing child. Perhaps they will find the child, and perhaps not. Perhaps the child simply became lost whilst playing in the forest and could not find their way home. Or perhaps tomorrow, when the other children go outside to play and begin dancing in the circle, chanting their nursery rhyme, we will see a gap just large enough for 3 extra children to join. And so I invite you to visit the Forest of 3. Early tomorrow, the determined search party will undoubtedly break the calm silence, the quiet serenity of the forest. But for the next few hours, all is still. Stroll through the tall, broad redwoods, the thick brush, the moist soil, the trickling creeks. Gaze through the foliage into the night sky to see the bright starlight and thin grey wisps of cloud flowing overhead. Eventually, you will arrive at the heart of the forest. Here stands 3 great redwoods, 100 feet taller and 100 years older than any others in the forest. They stand with their branches interwoven, as if dancing in a circle. The wind howls. The trees begin to sway. Sharp shadows are cast upon the trunks of the great redwoods. The shadows move across the bark, and it appears as if the trees are snarling at you, sneering at some great joke you cannot understand. The wind dies. Close your eyes. Listen for it. the soft rustle of the leaves overhead, the quiet trickle of water through streams, the small animals moving through the brush. Now it comes, so very distant yet so very clear, an innocent chorus carrying a sinister tone, the voice of the Forest of Three. Come play in the Forest of Three, you with I, and I with thee. Oh, such fun we have in store, lurking there, forevermore. It Screams by Sage of the Forlorn Path. Disgusting, humid, unmoving, and under just the right pressure from the bloated storm clouds, the air felt viscous and fetid, like drinking from a stagnant puddle in a dusty crawl space. The moisture clung to the man's skin, finding every bit of dirt and filth and huddling around it like a growing fungus. Even after showering the previous night, the humidity made him feel like he was glazed with a paste of dried sweat and dead skin. His hands felt like they'd been running through unwashed hair, left greasy and clammy. At the moment, a bar of soap and some running water would bring him more joy than a stack of gold bricks. The man was out in the woods of northern Maine, having just moved to the area and waiting to familiarize himself with the land. It was late autumn, and the sky of black clouds had just sprayed the forest with a thin drizzle before he'd left his home. The unfamiliar trees around him were blackened by the moisture, their obsidian bark visible through the webbing of moss that cocooned them. Mist hung above the damp ground, unchallenged, not even the slightest breeze present to dispel it. The woods were silent, every creature hiding. Even the drops of water on the pine trees stubbornly clung to their needles, as if afraid of falling and breaking the silence. Above the man's head, the branches of the trees, strong with age, wove a net to try and keep the forest floor eclipsed in darkness. But down below, the effects of time could be seen. Every tree limb within its vision was dead, starved of sunlight. The jagged spires remained extended, reaching out despite their wood now rotting. The man was no novice to the wilderness. As a Mainer, he had been around trees all of his life, but he had never before stood in a forest like this. It felt primeval, an ancient bastion that extended beyond the laws of man or God, indifferent to the passing eons, as if suspended in its own pocket of time. It felt like he was the first to walk through these woods in, perhaps, ever. This was a level of solitude that chilled him, for it was the farthest he had ever been from civilization. But there was more to it than that. He felt like he had entered a realm that was not truly part of nature. Whether it be in a steaming jungle or a lifeless desert, he would feel more at home, more in tune with the world than he was here. He came out of the woods and into a field, glad to escape the shadows of the trees. He looked up at the sky, at the dark clouds that claimed dominion over the land and refused the light of the sun. There were only a couple of hours left of sunlight. He needed to head home. These woods chilled his blood during the day. He didn't dare remain outside during the night. But he stayed at that spot, at the very edge of the field, looking back into the darkness of the trees on the other side. He wanted to get home. He wanted to get home and lock his doors, cover his windows, and hide beneath the covers until the weather cleared, but his mind wouldn't let him move from that spot. It was like he was trying to remember something or figure out a problem, and moving at all would disrupt his focus. There was something his subconscious wanted him to realize. He was surrounded by variables, all of which come together to create something. But what? The weather, the light, the moisture, the temperature, the time of year, they all culminated in something. Something that some part of him was aware of and recognized. A shiver rippled through his skin as he figured it out. In essence, he knew that if something bad was going to happen, it was going to happen here and now. This spot, this very second. It was like a darkness was gathering and would manifest into some incarnation of tragedy. He knew that anything could happen, that any number of unspeakable horrors could take place in the darkness of these trees, and the world would never know. As if the blood of 1,000,000 people could be shed in this forest, and the light of sun would never shine on even a drop. Would he trip and sprain his ankle? Was a rabid animal going to tear out his throat? Would some deranged killer bury a rusty knife in his back? Or would something that existed outside of human knowledge occur? Something bad was going to happen. He knew it. This place was cursed. His whole body shook, but he could not take a step, paralyzed by a fear that he didn't understand. Movement shook him from his trance. He saw it in the trees across the field. There was no wind, the air as still as the breath in a corpse's lungs. But the spindly branches swayed and bent. There was something there. He could see it, but he did not need eyes to see it. It was invisible to the gelatin spheres with their quivering irises, but his mind's eye could see it, like he was looking through an image etched in glass. Even when he blinked, he could see it in the darkness, seeing it with the eyes of his soul, and he could see it looking back at him. A new fear took him, a terror that he had never felt before but dwarfed every life experience. It was an older terror, something more than simply instinctive. It was primordial. It was universal, born from a knowledge that was written in even the most undeveloped strand of DNA. This thing, whatever it was that he was looking at, existed in total opposition to life itself. Its identity was that of a blasphemous sentience that did not belong in this world. Even the bacteria in the man's gut shivered in revulsion to the thing's presence. Had they the ability, they would be wailing like infants during a thunderstorm. They felt it, just as he did, that whatever the thing was, its existence was wrong. From his racing heart and seething pressure, blood began to run from the man's nose, and when the first drop fell from his lips, the creature snapped him out of his stupor with a noise. It was a blood-curdling scream. A woman's, like she was being stabbed with a rusty knife. The voice echoed throughout the wilderness, sounding so purely human, but the fact that the beast had made such a sound terrified the man beyond words. Shaken by that scream, he turned and ran back into the woods, sprinting harder and faster than ever in his life. Almost as soon as he started running, he could sense it behind him, chasing him like a hungry predator. It did not leave rhythmic footfalls, rather it would spontaneously thrash through the fallen leaves and underbrush, as if falling in and out of sync with reality as it moved. But every minute or so, it would give another bone-rattling scream, as if the man was running from someone being gruesomely murdered. There was no clear path in the man's mind. Adrenaline had robbed him of any sort of mental map leading him back to his home. Instead, he was simply reacting to the ground in front of him, going wherever he looked like he could cross easily. He avoided anything that could slow him down or drain his strength, aiming only for open areas and going downhill. To the man, the trees around him didn't feel mindlessly incapable of understanding what was going on. Rather, they felt utterly indifferent, as if turning away the eyes that they didn't have, bystanders to the nightmare he was trapped in. His vision was hindered by tears in his eyes. In the presence of this abomination, all courage and mental fortitude built from experiences in his life had been erased, leaving him crying like an abandoned child. He could feel the malice in the entity,
a mixture of sadistic hunger and bottomless hatred. It did not breathe, but he felt breath on the back of his neck. The man did not want to die, not by the hands of this thing. He no longer feared death, as long as it was anywhere but here. Running along the edge of a steep hillside, his foot slipped on the wet leaves of the ground. He fell rolling down the cliff without any way to stop himself. He hit multiple trees as he slid, beating and bloodying him, but unable to overcome his inertia and save him. Finally, he reached the bottom and landed in a creek. His forehead struck an exposed stone, cutting his face and leaving him disoriented. But fear wouldn't let him rest. He forced himself to his feet and scrambled up to the other side. Once upon stable footing, he resumed running. His face was covered in blood and the frigid water of the creek was carried in every fiber of his clothes, but he continued running. He no longer knew if the beast was still after him. Rather, his rattled brain sensed it everywhere. Even if it were to scream right in his ear, he wouldn't hear it over his own heart racing. His breath was haggard, his lungs feeling like they were filled with broken glass, and his steps were unbalanced and awkward. His body was at its limits, but fear pushed him forward. He lost track of time as he ran, the forest around him never ending, every tree looking exactly like the ones around it. Finally, his strength gave out and he collapsed. Cold and exhaustion had left him half dead, but the fear within him wouldn't let him lose consciousness. Finally, his heart slowed just enough for him to hear another scream. It sounded like someone was being slaughtered in a horror movie, but it was off in the distance. Had he escaped the beast? Had it lost track of him? The small glimmer of hope restored something of his reasoning. His head injury had muddled his thoughts, but he was beginning to think clearly. He slowly pushed himself up, checking his surroundings. The sky was darkening, and soon he would be totally blind. But even in the shadows of the woods, he saw something unusually large and dark. It didn't look natural. Wait, was that a house? A few sparks of energy crackled in him, some of his stamina restored with hope acting as a crutch for his exhausted body. He forced himself back onto his feet and staggered closer. He was right. It was a house, built on a hillside. But the closer he got, the less it made sense. It was a 2-story house, but it looked dilapidated and there were no power lines. It had a front porch with an overhanging roof and 2 forward-facing windows on the 2nd floor, making it almost look like a skull with its mouth hanging open. He had no idea how long ago it was built, but judging from the rickety pickup truck parked next to it, it was old. There was no sign of life from where he could see, no lights or noise, but there was something on the windows. The man shivered, not from the autumn air or his wet clothes, but from the realization that the windows were splashed with blood. On the left side, 2nd floor window, a lone handprint was pressed into the blood. What truly scared the man was how small the handprint was. Had the people here been killed by what was chasing him? Or was it something else altogether? Forget it. Once he got to a place with service, he'd call the cops and let them figure it out. He limped over to the truck. It was even older than he was, but judging by the amount of leaves and pine needles strewn across it, it had been sitting in that spot for only a few days. However, upon searching the cab, he couldn't find any keys. There was only one place they could be. The man looked up at the house and shuddered. Whatever happened in there, he didn't want to see it. But he had no choice. He grabbed an old flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped onto the front porch. Up close, this place looked like it'd been made completely by hand, probably without even power tools. The man knocked on the door and heard nothing inside. With a deep breath to give himself strength, he turned the rusty doorknob and a wooden slab swung open. He stepped inside and shined the flashlight on the interior of the house, feeling himself getting sick from the sight. The first floor of the house was a single room, the floor littered with several bodies and various pieces of others. In this sealed house, the metallic stench of their shed blood was overpowering, along with the heinous odor of voided bowels and vapors of decay. All of the furniture in the house is made of carved wood from the forest and either animal hides or some kind of fabric and stuffing from a bygone era. The walls were lined with shelves, each decorated with leather-bound books and various pieces of animals, either mummified or preserved in mason jars. The man shined his flashlight on the floor and shuddered. A pentagram had been painted with blood, with a candle stationed at each corner. In the center was a ball of fur, likely a dead animal. Revulsion overtook the man, but he was too terrified to give in to squeamishness. He shut and locked the door behind him and covered the windows with mud made from the ashes from the fireplace to make sure his pursuer didn't see the light he was carrying. With as little physical contact as possible, he checked the bodies for the keys to the truck, but came up empty. He then searched the rest of the first floor, including the colonial-style kitchen. Night had fallen, and he gave up. Even if he did find the keys to the truck, he didn't want to be out in the darkness. It would be better to wait until morning, hopefully when there would be sunlight. Resigned to his fate, the man went to work on building a fire in the stone hearth. With some dusty matches and dry firewood stacked by the door, he managed to get a fire going. After the day he had, the warmth and the light of the fire was comfort beyond words. Upon feeling the heat on his hands and face, it was like the exhaustion and the chill he had been ignoring until now enveloped him. Now he could dry his clothes and warm himself up. But the fire also made him nervous. What if the beast smelled the smoke and came here? What if some of the light managed to pass through the windows or the door? He sat there for a long while, simply staring into the flames. Even without a refrigerator, the kitchen had some preserved food, but he wasn't even in the mood for eating. Despite his exhaustion, it was hard for him to work up an appetite when surrounded by corpses and forced to bask in their stench. Upstairs, there were probably beds for him to sleep in, but he didn't dare go up there. He didn't want to leave the warmth and the security of the fire. He didn't want to touch the filthy sheets that these backwoods savages slept in. And most of all, he didn't want to find the remains of whoever left that small handprint on the upstairs window. He would be content to simply sleep on the floor by the fire, if he could even sleep at all. His thoughts always drifted back to the dead bodies surrounding him. What the hell were these people doing? What kind of evil rituals were they into? That pentagram, had they used it to summon the beast from the woods? Was that animal in the center a sacrifice? From the looks of it, whatever they had summoned, it turned on them. Just what on earth had they unleashed? Tack, tack, tack. His blood turning to cold slurry, the man spun around and looked to the windows. There, out on the porch, something was tapping on the glass. Even through the ash smeared across the window, he could see it. A shadow darker than the night itself. It had found him. He scrambled up to his feet just as the door burst open. It stood there, staring at him. All of the fear the man had felt before came rushing back, his body shivering and tears falling from his eyes. No, please, anything but this. He didn't want to die here, for this house to be his tomb. The beast rushed towards him, and before the man could move, he felt himself cut. He felt his flesh torn and his blood spilling out. He screamed in pain and terror and fell to the floor. With his life fading, he stared at the horror standing over him. Before closing his eyes, the beast screamed, its voice sounding exactly like his own. I stumbled across a feeding ground in the forest. By Merck Fellow. I grew up in a small town outside Alberta, Canada. It was a quiet place for so many months of the year. There wasn't a whole lot of people living there, but the amount of tourists that would come by to see the mountain ranges, it felt like a metropolis. I worked at a small souvenir shop my grandfather owned when I was 16. I was fortunate enough to have this opportunity, as there wasn't a whole lot in regards to employment for the youth here. My grandfather was a smart man. While he did drop out of school in the 4th grade, he knew how to do many things. For one, he ran his own business. On top of that, he would trap animals, selling the more valuable pelts and using the lesser ones in crafts, which he'd display for sale at the shop. He was also a great storyteller, a trait he says he gained from his own grandfather. Most of the stories were of encounters with great moose that towered over him, or the time he fell and broke his leg while trapping, forcing him to crawl back to town. One story in particular that piqued my interest was about a boy who encountered a beast in the forest. The beast chased the boy back into the town, where he was driven away by the boy's father, who trapped it inside a cave by piling rocks at the entrance. The idea of a beast lurking in the forest frightened me, but also fascinated me. I would share this story with the other youths that would stop by the shop, although none never shared quite the same reaction I would every time I heard the tale. It was late February when the shop really picked up in its volume of customers. The weather wasn't the worst, and the mountains still had a fair amount of snow blanketed them. My grandfather was extremely busy, and he had me on for more hours than usual during this time. Every day after he closed around 5, we'd go to his place where my grandmother would have our dinner on the table and hurry to eat it before we'd set out to check a few of his traps. Although it was a means of making money, my grandfather found solace in trapping, especially after repeating hectic work days. He enjoyed having me along as well, calling me his prodigy from time to time. The path we'd take was rather short and looped around the forest behind his house. With it being so dark, he would have preferred to not take me deeper into the trees. Usually we'd end up with anywhere between 9 to 10 rabbits, which he tied together by the back paws and throw over his shoulder. One day in particular went by slower than any of the others. We'd only had a handful of patrons by the early afternoon, which was unusual. My grandfather decided to call it a day and close up the shop. As he locked up, he asked if I wanted to go deeper into the woods and check some of his bigger traps. Ecstatic, I agreed and rushed to bundle up all my snow gear. We walked up the usual path first, finding some rabbits before heading further in. The trail that we walked was narrow. Towering pine trees and the occasional birch let in only a slither of sunlight as the branches grew across the path, in our way and above us. My grandfather was busy cracking branches to make it easier for me to follow behind, a gesture I'd come to appreciate later on. Soon we came across the first in a dozen traps. In the trap was a red fox. My grandfather pulled the device open and slugged the carcass over his shoulder, as he done with the rabbits. "I figure I can carry one more and then I'll have you grab a few. I didn't think it'd be this bountiful. You may even return home with a snowmobile," said my grandfather, walking along slowly. We continued on for some time, finding some empty traps and others bearing an animal. By the time we were halfway done, I had 2 foxes over my shoulder, and an imitation of my grandfather. Shortly afterwards, we arrived to the last set of traps. They were lined along the side of the trail in places it was evident animals have traveled through. To my grandfather's dismay, each trap was empty, but the snow was still stained with blood. We turned our way back out to the trail, the sun now setting above us. A few weeks had passed by and my grandfather ended up falling ill. He was forced to close the shop for a period of time whilst he recovered. This had also rendered him unable to check his traps. Me, being inspired by my grandfather, had decided to go out and check them on my own in a vain attempt to impress him. I went early in the morning as to not get lost in the dark. I equipped myself with a cheap folding knife and pellet gun, and wandered the trail for hours until every trap was checked, and I had returned to my grandfather with 7 rabbits and no foxes. Although he was proud, he scolded me for going on my own without notifying him. He sat me down and put a hand on my shoulder. He cleared his throat and began telling me the story of the boy and the beast, reminding me of the dangers of the forest. More time had passed and my grandfather's health had worsened. What seemed to be just any illness was soon determined to be a cancer in the 4th stage. He passed in the first week of April, leaving me feeling isolated and alone. I struggled with the passing for some time, distancing myself from anything and everything that I could. For what reason I didn't know. I grieved as anyone would and eventually began accepting that he was gone. It was here that I had an idea to take over his traps and sell the furs for myself. A young and foolish me went into the forest with my usual equipment, though this time I dragged a small sleigh behind me. I spent nearly all day searching for traps, opening them, removing the carcass, and securing the top of the sleigh. This cycle continued on late into the day. Soon enough, gone were the rays of sunshine that broke through the trees. Instead, they were replaced with an ineffectual moonlight. I continued on, however, trying my best to ignore the darkness. I was determined to succeed in the memory of my grandfather, but the darkness triggered thoughts of the beast which chased the boy in the story that I loved. I felt an unease over me as I found the last remaining traps. All were full except for one. I inspected the area around it and noticed paw prints going deeper into the trees. In a regretful and idiotic decision, I picked up the trap and crawled on my stomach under the low-hanging branches, tailing the animal that passed through. I entered into a clearing. There were no trees, and the snow was illuminated better than back on the path. It was here I discovered numerous piles of small bones and pools of blood intertwined with the snow. I felt a vigorous wave of unrest come over me. Was this the feeding ground for a wolf? I knew that there were wolves in the area. Or was it a bear? I hoped that it was neither, and turned to head back down the trail before I was interrupted by the snapping of twigs and crunching of snow. My unrest was now full-blown anxiety as I ran to the fox's path. I was stopped instantaneously as the maimed carcass of a fox landed in front of me. I felt nothing now but pure terror as I leaped over the carcass to flee to safety. I pushed my body through the small trail to get back to the path, exhausting myself with vigorous strides. As I emerged through the thicket of trees, the heavy breaths of some animal grew louder and louder, coinciding with the thunderous crunching and cracking of branches behind me. I sprinted through the path, a task which would have been impossible if it were not for my grandfather clearing it of sticks. I continued down the snowy passage, gasping for air as I did so. I dared not to look behind me, for I feared the terror that haunted me. I kept my head straight and just kept running. I could feel a sharp sensation in my chest. I needed to catch my breath, but I also needed to leave the forest. I closed my eyes and attempted to muster any strength I could have left, but I fell, at the edge of the trees. I peered behind me to see a sight which would go on to haunt my dreams. Bolting towards me was a horrid beast. It ran on all fours, strikingly similar to a wolf or coyote, but it was much larger, around the size of a grizzly bear, but leaner. It had an elongated snout which bared sharp teeth that were arranged in neat rows. Its yellow eyes glared as it stared into mine. The fur covering its body was long, fabricating a shaggy appearance as the moonlight reflected off its deep blackness. It continued making its way over to me, determined to kill. I removed the small pellet gun from my jacket and pulled the trigger. With enough luck, the pellet pierced the thing's eyes, sending it into a rage. It howled loud in pain, similar to how an owl would screech. While it flailed wildly and hit the snowy ground with its 2 heavy fists, it turned and retreated back into the abyss that was the forest. Many years have passed since that encounter in the forest, and I'm finding myself dwelling on it quite a bit. It comes back in my dreams. The vivid image of that thing on the path in the forest where I'd been with my grandfather. It's because of this that I had to move deeper into the city, never once returning to that mountain town again. Although if I'm brutally honest, the idea of going back there for some sort of closure crosses my mind.
Increasingly so. You see, recently my mother informed me that it was discovered there was a cave in the forest where my grandfather used to trap. Tucked away beside a clearing, behind some trees, with a large pile of rocks strewn to the side. The Beast in the Forest. I want to set down recent events in my life, because I'm afraid that this may be my last chance. To begin with, my name is Leon Cowles. I was born in Provo, Utah, although I lived most of my life here in Portland, Oregon. I've always been a rather intellectual person, preferring books and video games to basketball and football. In grade school, I was a loner and had few, if any, friends. In middle and high school, I began to read fantasy novels and mild occult books. At first, just that Wiccan fluff that, if anything, keeps people from learning anything of real importance or historical accuracy. Eventually, I got into more intelligent and orthodox literature, such as carefully documented paranormal events and, well, Kabbalic lore. In college, at the Institute of Jewelry Technology in Paris, Texas, my reading turned to Poe, Borge, and Lovecraft. I learned a bit of Hebrew and Latin to be able to read some occult books whose English translations I didn't trust. I also learned the Futhark and Arabic alphabets to better understand various magical symbols. After returning home and finding a job as a jeweler for a local reseller, I started taking long walks in my spare time. I've always felt out of place in society and hiked through the local forests and mountains to be alone. The more isolated and untouched, the better. The Pacific Northwest is fortunately rich in forests and wild areas to wander to my heart's content. Over time, I became adept at finding excellent locations, sometimes shockingly close to civilization, yet somehow unnoticed by everyone who passes by. I've even run across some ruins here and there, some amazingly close to town, but abandoned long ago nonetheless. In a place that can be found on no city map, only 10 blocks from my house, I found an abandoned water reservoir, along with several buildings, left to slowly decay many decades ago. Beneath Rocky Boot, I found a long maze of natural caves, totally untouched by anyone so far, not a half a mile from two of the biggest freeways in the state. On an island in the Columbia River that I swam to, I found an ancient farmhouse and a barn, quietly decomposing for who knows how long. The places with ruins are my favorite, bringing a much more solid feeling to the sense of loss and past wonder that I feel about the world. Not my favorite due to the high foot traffic some days, but certainly very close by for me is the famous Forest Park. The largest city park in the world is more than 11 miles long and several miles wide in some areas. It covers more than 5,100 acres, and as the name implies, it's almost entirely covered in dense, old-growth forest. It's easy to lose your way along the many miles of winding trails, and more than once I've gotten turned around myself, despite my experience outdoors. Forest Park is a wild and beautiful place in the light of day, but at night, and in certain especially overgrown groves, where the dense canopy blots out most of the daylight, it has a sinister and feral reputation. Perhaps its dangers lie in the many fissures, canyons, and steep, and often wet, trails. Or just maybe it has something to do with certain ruins in its depths. There are also occasional reports of great cats. We have mountain lions in the area, who carry off small dogs and local animals. Honest fact is that there is danger present in Forest Park after darkness falls. Once every few years, a body or two is found by hikers or their dogs, often old, partially eaten, and badly decomposed. I remember in 1999, they found a number of bodies, arranged in some kind of strange diagram over several hundred feet. Even this year, in 2008, they found 2 corpses there. My own incident at Forest Park began one early afternoon a week ago. I was going to go hiking in the southern central region on a few trails that I'd never been on before. I'd planned on being out until evening, so I brought along a lunch, iced tea, my mini flashlight. One never knows when they'll find a new cave or ruin, and notebook. I parked my car at the Lower McCleary trailhead and set off along the edge of the creek, heading into the park. Along my left, the creek ended under a huge wooden lattice that led into a huge sewer pipe and downhill under the city and into the Willamette River. There's a rumor that the Portland catacombs connect to the sewer pipe at some point. Further along the creek is some kind of wooden walkways, raised 20 feet or so above the water, and connected to some old crumbling masonry in and beside the stream. I've read that this used to be part of the original watershed that served Portland, and I guessed that this was part of it. In the bed of the creek, several ancient stone walls and pieces of brickwork can be seen to those with a keen eye. Beyond a bridge and a little waterfall, off the trail, up a hill and behind a huge pine tree, a headstone with the name Oliver can be seen. No one has ever dug up the little grave, so no one knows who or what Oliver used to be. Further still along the steep, rocky, and often slippery wet trail, about 1 mile in, is the witch's house. This was once a public restroom, but in 1962 it was critically damaged by a storm and abandoned, rather than replaced. It's now by far the best known and most recent ruin in the park. It's the stone walls and foundation of a small house built into the side of a steep hill. The 2 basement rooms loomed cold, empty, and reeking of urine and pot. Through the long, open wall facing the trail and creek, at either side of the house is a stone staircase, leading into the large single room above. I climbed the stairs and looked through the open doorway to see what I would find today. The witch's house has a very bad reputation after dark, and has its nickname for a reason. It's said that witches and strange cults perform bizarre rituals here. It's strange that although everyone knows about it, nothing is done to prevent it. But I guess no cop wants to hike at night along a dangerous trail without a damn good reason, especially when it would be difficult, if not impossible, for backup to be called in under 20 minutes. The tall hills on either side of the valley also seem to have a confounded way of disrupting radio signals and cell phones in the area, so there isn't even a guarantee that you'd even be able to get a call out. When I looked in, I saw that the cultists had been busy the night before. A red chalk diagram of Kabbalistic origin still lay on the floor. A dozen burnt candles lined its parameters, and a now dry, garnet-colored fluid was splattered on the floors and walls. Amazingly, anyone who frequents this part of the park will know that this isn't a rare occurrence. Outside of the circle, near the corner of the room, was written some Hebrew symbols, arranged in what appeared to be some kind of appeal or prayer. I carefully set down what was written. Afterwards, I took a bit of time to translate, as best I could with my limited knowledge of Hebrew. It said roughly, "We present an offering/sacrifice of blood in respect, awe, fear to you, mighty Clippeth. May your hunger, anger, be appeased and satisfied." The Clippeth, in Kabbalic lore, are demons utterly alien to this universe. They are neither truly alive or dead by our standards and seem to be ruled by different laws and physics than our own. According to lore, they existed before this world or universe, their own being destroyed during the creation of ours. To things of this world they are utterly malignant evil, insane hated, and blasphemy given form. Although they are said to be mutable in nature, then even attributing them forms may be inaccurate. Most Kabbalists say that they are only a myth, representing sin, and the few that believe in them, even Aleister Crowley, would never try to bargain or make pacts with them, for they comprehend no alliance and seek only to destroy and consume truly living things. I wish now that I'd taken the legends of the Clippeth more seriously, but I thought of them as only legendary monsters like dragons and jinn. After writing down that strange appeal, I continued on, up the hill and away from the strange and evil stone house. I walked for miles, winding this way and that through the hills and forest, enjoying the quiet and solitude of the day. And eventually I became hungry and left the trail, slipping between the bushes and undergrowth. I moved about 50 feet off the trail and into a clearing to sit down and eat. While eating my lunch of sandwiches and iced tea, a strange thing happened. Something large moved in the vegetation, maybe 40 feet away off to my left. Thinking that it was a dog or a deer, I stood up to look, but saw nothing. A moment later, the commotion began again. I could now actually see the plant life being shoved aside and hear leaves and twigs being crushed. Whatever was making the noise had to be at least as large as a human, but I couldn't see anything at all. It seemed to be moving in an elliptical pattern, circling behind me and getting closer. After maybe 2 minutes, the noise had moved in about a 90-degree arc, and was now behind me and 30 feet or less away. It still sounded quite large, and was still totally unseen despite the plant life being no more than 3 feet tall. At this point, I was quite alarmed, and decided that I might not want to see whatever was out there. I picked up my day pack and quickly moved back to the trail off into the distance. An hour later, I had all but forgotten my brush with the unseen. It was starting to become dusk, although I didn't have a watch on, so I don't know the exact time. I had begun to circle around on the trails and head back towards my car, although I was taking a small, seldom-used trail I'd never been on before. As I was circling the little hill, I saw some kind of stone pillar, standing weathered and overgrown off the trail on my right. Always fascinated by the possibility of examining forgotten artifacts, I went to see what it was. The pillar was a basalt column, about 4 feet high, with some extremely weathered inscriptions on it. The style looked like part of a Pacific Northwest Indian tribe. It seemed to be a picture of a hairy biped that was eating or rending small humans. It made me think of their legends of the old woman of the forest, who some whisper was the same as a Sasquatch. A huge hairy ape witch who would spirit off young children, never to be seen again. About 40 feet away, I saw another little obelisk that looked identical to the ones I just looked at. In between, I saw a large, low circular block of concrete and a couple of large basalt blocks with channels cut into the tops and sides. I couldn't decide the original purpose of the blocks. The concrete cylinder looks like an old cistern. It was maybe 15 or 16 feet across, but it had barely been altered. The cement plate that served as a cap, and was almost a foot thick, had been partially removed. It had been lifted and slid to the side, leaving about a 3-foot gap to look into. Peering down into it with the aid of my flashlight, I could see that it was about 30 feet deep and badly damaged by the hands of time and/or vandals. Handholds had been gouged into the side of the walls, leading down into the cistern floor. A bed of molding leaves and sticks covered the floor, which struck me as odd, since the cap appeared only to have been moved extremely recently, and it wasn't late enough in the season for leaves to start falling anyway. I could also see 2 large holes in the cement tube at the bottom, one on either side. One of the holes looked quite large, 6 or 7 feet, while the other side looked quite a bit smaller, maybe 4 feet in diameter. Having no fear of the dark, enclosed spaces or heights, I began climbing down to further explore this new find. The odor of decaying plants, and possibly animal matter, hung thick in the air, along with the deep scent of wet earth. Both holes led into crudely cut rock and earth passages. I went into the larger one first and followed it back into the hill. I'm not quite sure how long the passage was before it opened into a small chamber. Visually, it looked like it must have been 40 feet, and possibly more, but I completely passed through it in only 7 steps, which should only take me 20 or 21 feet. The low chamber was almost spherical, and looked to be about 12 feet across. It looked like the nest of some large animal, with a bed of dirty rags and pale sticks in one corner. I saw a couple of shiny glimmers poking out of the pile and bent down to examine it. The first was an impressive amethyst crystal, about 6 inches long, with many tiny black and red inclusions suspended inside it. The 6 sides, although they looked natural, had been polished, and the base had been ground flat, and polished as well. Some strange glyphs had been engraved into the 6 triangular facets that formed the point. Even with a fairly broad knowledge of runes and symbols, I was at a loss of the origins of these symbols. They did look somewhat like the pictographs I've seen in Central and South American coins and calendars. The crystals had another quality that made it odd, unique, and sinister in aspect. Whenever I looked away, I could see the crystal with only my peripheral vision. The little red and black inclusions would seem to come to life and start moving, like minuscule fish swimming about in an aquarium. But as soon as I would look at it, they would stop and be just as I had seen them before. As a jeweler, I've seen a number of exotic techniques for creating illusions in gemstones. Some make it appear to be larger or brighter than they actually are. Some are cut in specific ways to conceal defects, reflect a double image, or even appear to move with the setting. But I've never seen anything like this. Pocketing the crystal for later examination, I turned my attention to the other shiny bit, poking out from under the grimy rag. It was a watch from the 1980s. Its spring band was torn and its crystal cracked. A shiver went down my spine as my gaze returned to the pile and the pale sticks. As I gingerly pulled one out to look at it, I was horrified to see what I already feared. What I was holding was clearly a human arm or leg bone, snapped in half and many years old. Dropping the once human thing, I turned to retreat from this den of evil. When I got back to the cistern, I looked up expecting to climb back out to safety, but was momentarily paralyzed by fear when I saw something coming into the hold from outside. I shut off my flashlight and darted into a smaller tunnel to hide from whatever it was. It appeared to be a human figure, floating in midair and descending past the concrete lid. It then abruptly fell into an unmoving heap before me, with a sickening crunch, splat, quite obviously dead. It was a man, wearing torn and filthy jeans, an equally filthy flannel shirt, and worn and dirty sneakers. His eyes were open with a look of absolute fear that I'll never be able to forget. His wild and unkempt beard was a sea of red from what must have been a terminal throat wound. Above I saw nothing. Then the lid slowly began to grate shut. I could see a ghost-like shadow clinging to the gouged handholds in the wall with its feet, and the lid in its hands. It looked like a large black ape, with huge bat-like ears, a fanged canine-like snout, and immense cruel claws on long, ropey arms. As the lid slid shut, it seemed to become more and more corporeal, until just before all the light faded, it looked completely opaque. I sat still for a moment, hoping to escape its notice, when a huge weight fell invisibly before me, crushing leaves and sticks. I heard a sliding sound, like a giant rag doll being dragged around, then a nauseous crunching and slurping noise that I thankfully couldn't see. Hoping that the nightmare fiend before me was adequately distracted, I began to slowly and blindly move back into the smaller tunnel. Unfortunately, with all the rubble and shattered cistern wall around me, I nearly slipped and had to catch myself with my hand, making a small but audible slapping sound. The crunching and slurping instantly stopped, and the giant ragdoll fell onto the floor. A sniffing sound and the crunch of leaves a step closer than it had been moments ago. I knew it had found me, and my mind momentarily snapped. I would attack the unseen thing and at least not go down without a fight. I suddenly picked up a large rock. I think it was about the size of a brick, and switched on my flashlight, hoping to catch the living nightmare by surprise. The surprise was all mine, though. All I saw was the discarded corpse, now even more reddened than it was before. Where was the black horror? Was it hiding in the cistern beyond my field of vision? Then another step was heard, crunching leaves and twigs even closer to me. I saw the leaves stir, but couldn't see the monster. Unable to understand where it was or how to fight it, I threw my stone missile with all my strength and fury of my adrenaline-flushed body. All at once, the rock struck the air and deflected off to the side. A small spray of foul black fluid fell onto the ground, and an unearthly scream of pain and rage began not 10 feet in front of me. I turned and ran. As I turned to retreat, I saw from the edge of my flashlight's illumination a huge ghostly ape clutching its face with a giant feral paw. I fled as fast as I could to wherever the tunnel led. My attack momentarily stunned the thing, I think, and it was unable to maneuver its huge bulk through the small tunnel as quickly as I could. The tunnel wound about and descended over a huge distance. Miles, I think. It eventually broke through another concrete wall and into a wide drainage sewer, one side definitely ascending and the other descending. I could no longer hear the black fiend behind me, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I pulled off my day pack, taking only my notebook, and tossed it down the sewer in the descending direction, just at the edge of the water. I hoped this would mislead the phantom ape and buy me a bit more time, should it reach the wider sewer before I was able to find my way out. I ran off in the opposite direction, taking care only to step in the water to help conceal my scent. The tunnel was about 7 feet wide in diameter, with water flowing in a channel along the bottom. The water looked fairly clear and clean, except for the occasional leaf or two. Little salamanders and crayfish scuttled out of my path as I went, making me pretty sure I was in the sewer below the McCleary trailhead. After about a quarter of a mile, I began to see a lighter patch in the darkness. Another minute and I was at the sewer mouth, under the giant wooden lattice I had seen earlier that day. Night had come to the overgrown valley while I was trapped underground. Except for the gurgling of the little creek, all the world seemed as still and quiet as the grave. Fortunately, escape was possible for me through the wooden wall. Near the middle of the lattice, just above the level of the water, a large rock was wedged between the two beams. I was easily able to squeeze through this slightly enlarged gap, being both thin and flexible. Now I was only 1,000 feet from my car. I climbed the lattice back up to the trail, now exhausted, and kept moving as quickly as I could towards my goal. My pants were ripped in several places, and my hands were covered in scratches from the speed of my desperate flight. But I was at least alive. I climbed back into my car, drove home, and collapsed into a deep, dreamless sleep. Somehow, I sleep better when I'm under stress. I don't know why, but I do. I thought I was safe. I thought that the nightmare was behind me. A week later, and I was starting to feel better. In the meantime, I had done some reading and research. I've decided that the thing that I saw was a Qliphoth. Ruled by the laws of an extinct universe, it seems that it reacts to light differently, being visible in darkness rather than light. If those Indian columns are any indication of how long it's been around, then I would guess that it's probably unaging. It may not even be able to be killed at all. However, I'm sure that something as vile and violent as that isn't around and active all the time, or the body count would be in the hundreds each year. Perhaps it can only be alive at certain times, or under certain astrological conditions. I don't know. The amethyst still baffles me. I can't be sure what connection it has to the Qliphoth. It may be the thing that binds it to this world, like a golem's phylactery. But it's not over. Earlier today, when I was looking into my backyard, I saw the bushes being moved through, and something stirring the fallen leaves on the grass. I watched carefully, and know that it was no mere wind or neighborhood cat. I know it's come for me, another crystal, or both. I smashed the crystal moments before I started writing this. Now all I can do is wait. See what happens.
Out in the Woods by Prozac 101. What you're about to listen to is a narration of a story posted on 4chan's Paranormal X board on Halloween Day of 2013 by an unknown user by the name of Prozac101. Being a daily visitor to X, I was one of the first people to reply to the person's post, and I think it's best that I tell you that I was pretty creeped out by what I had read, probably the most I have been in a long time. It's kind of hard for me to explain the strange feelings I got, but there was something quite different about her story, due to the fact I could not stop thinking about it for days after it had been first posted on the board. Just to make everything clear, I'm not entirely the author of this piece, just merely an anonymous editor that felt like it was his duty to share Prozac101's story even further with the world. Hey X, just thought I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mother went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I could hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree, and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just felt too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high it was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath me that paralyzed me in shock. "Hey kid!" I was gripped by a sudden strong urge of fear for a moment. The voice had come directly from underneath me. I strained to look down, but couldn't see anything from over the ledge. For a long time I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I almost soon convinced myself that I imagined the man's voice at all. "Oh, now you can hear me." His voice was much louder this time. As I yelled something out, I scrambled up the log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The birdsong was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all in my imagination, by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly, "Come down here or I'll grab ya!" It was so loud, it was as if something screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself, staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above me and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling, and crying at the top of a fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somehow recovered, exhibiting that naive hard skin of a child, although I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside to the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk, when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you have ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed made me. On one of these nights, it got mistier than it ever had been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disorientated, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last road, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all of the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to even see my own knees. I decided to head to the house, since we had more than enough wood for the night. However, it was getting pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mist all around from where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow, pointing left. Looks vaguely like something my mum would make, I rationalized, to keep me from getting lost. So, foolishly, I followed the direction set by that green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppy written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were the only shot I had at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat. So I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for the trees, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near the house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry there a little. As I slumped against the pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins in my arms. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by all these notes, all of which looked fresh and without a sign of decay despite the previous week's non-stop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood run cold. I stood to my knees, dead silent, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading that horrible note over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on that note, in big green letters, was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and the mist lapped at the back of my neck like a decaying breath of something running right behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors quickly and crawled into bed, where I remained, unsleeping, till morning. Mother just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any kind of strange things I had, although we mutually shared a peculiar oppressive quality that the house interior had on us, and its place in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living way out in the country in the opposite direction of everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in the first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from my mother in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back. "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m, when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and not, by any means, dare go home. I remember those bleak torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mum's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mum and Grandmother were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all of the colour had drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, She even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This is what happened the night when I was at Amanda's, as she described in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy going over her latest draft. At first it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while my mother became aware of and vaguely irritated by a tiny thumping noise near her head at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw fat brown moths of a kind we often got at the place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched open wide, showing all of the white. She barely stifled a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move nor blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the bush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face increasingly continued to press out at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence her later text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me behind the tree just started moving as if it were mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree. My mum said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The person that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the same silent speed-talking thing, then turning to whisper to the thing next to her. Then it would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, it suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working lock, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described it. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt against the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct, vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird, continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice and then, Virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door, where an awful white face could be seen staring right at her, mouth contorting and gaping in what sounded like highly sped-up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted out of the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before finally getting out. Running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off. She said that as she glanced back, right at the end of the prolonged drive, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at the broken bedroom window, watching her as the car got further and further away from the house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told me this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I honestly and fully believe that she experienced what she says she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once, with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came up from another state to help us move. Mum had already found a place in town and had moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his trunk with all the things that were left inside. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, only two things left worth mentioning. Number one, when we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed and rocks were lying on the floor. Number two, Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When we came back, he asked how long we'd had a swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the weeks since we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of an old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I'd stopped climbing many years ago. It was an obviously new rope, and a nicely polished, sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad wanted to keep my mind from recent events. He doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable, said a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we literally had no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in all of that space, and never in my time living there did I ever see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it all go and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared about talking about it, but for a long while I couldn't. Seeing as it's Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and that swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles obliviously towards it. The entities of Clarwood. If you're ever in Canterbury or its surrounding areas, I suggest you stay away from Clarwood. It's fairly small and remarkably unexceptional compared to some of the other woodland in the area, so most people tend to avoid it. This made it a perfect place for an impromptu camping trip for me to get away from it all. It's actually quite dense woodland when you get right into it, giving you that feeling of utter isolation from the rest of the world. This made it the perfect spot, or so it seemed. You see, there is a reason why Clarwood has been left nearly untouched for decades. There's a reason why the local people choose to avoid it. Hell, the road leading through it hasn't been used in so long the overgrowth has claimed it. But we'll get to that later. The day had dawned, the car was packed, and the drinking had begun. Of course, as is the way with most things, the journey wasn't as smooth as one would have hoped. The road which leads through Clarwood was actually a lot worse than I had anticipated. It was in a state of complete disrepair, with weeds and brambles completely immersing it. I had to leave my car in the closest spot I could find and walk the rest of the way, which wasn't easy with the gear I had. This really was a laborious task. The forest was thick and unforgiving, leaving me scratched and bruised from my battle with the foliage. I had a small knife with me, which I used to hack through the brush, but it was still a challenging task. I was beginning to get a bit nervous at this point. I'd never been camping by myself before, especially not in the middle of the woods, but I decided now was as good a time as any to prove to myself that I could do it. That, and I had just watched 20 episodes of Bear Grylls the night before and figured, hey, if he can do it, why can't I? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Clarwood is very quiet, almost silent in fact. You'd expect to hear birds singing and the local wildlife going about their day-to-day, but there was nothing. It seemed as if I was the only living thing in the forest. It was hard to shake the feeling, but I stayed rational and told myself to stop being stupid. So I kept going. As luck would have it, after only about an hour's walk, I managed to find a great clearing to set up in. It was about 30 feet in diameter and almost a perfect circle, with one solitary tree off to the north, just breaking the line of other trees. There was also an interesting rock formation about 30 feet away from it. It looked like some sort of scepter. It had a large black spherical rock atop a long black cuboid. I marveled at it for a few seconds before moving on. I decided to set up a camp here. Darkness was creeping in, as was the general panic at the very thought of having to set up my tent blind, so this seemed like the best spot I would find. I'm not even sure what time of day it was. The forest canopy is so dense, not a lot of light manages to seep through. Luckily, my tent was just a pop-up, which you needed to peg down, so it was set up in no time. I'll call her Lucy, I said, chuckling to myself. She's big enough to fit 3 men in as well. I laughed to myself for a while, cursing the fact there was no one around to hear my spectacular joke. I then grabbed my chair, started a fire, and got to drinking. The tent was on my left. The fire was dead ahead. The place where I, relieved myself, was behind me. And the thick tree line was all around. Still cannot believe how dark that night was. The darkness was suffocating. I'm not sure if it was because I was nervous or what, but I felt as if I was gasping for air. I couldn't see past the fire. I could barely even see my own tent for that matter. I tried to take my mind off things by carrying on with roasting marshmallows and listening to music, but lo and behold, my phone was dead. Have you ever experienced a silence so intense it's almost deafening? There was literally no noise anywhere. I could almost hear my insides working as I scoffed down marshmallows, desperately trying to fight off the overwhelming panic I could sense drawing in upon me. All of a sudden, the silence was broken. There was a rustling of leaves about 10 feet to the right of me. Dim lights appeared around the clearing, I'm not sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if it was just the ambience of the fire. I can't even imagine how much I must have looked like a deer in the headlights at that moment. My head turned faster than a bullet leaves the gun. Seriously, I should have sprained my neck or something, because that was inhuman how fast I turned. I was straining my eyes and craning my neck, desperately trying to identify the cause of the noise, when I saw it. It was only because it moved again that I noticed it. Had it stayed still, I would have missed it forever. There was a tiny little bunny rabbit on the floor, hopping around without a care in the world. I breathed a sigh of relief, cleaned up the metaphorical shit from my pants, and chuckled to myself about being such a coward. I didn't sleep at all that night. It was too dark, too quiet, you know? I felt, I don't know, watched. It's hard to explain. I felt as if at any moment someone or something would come crashing through Lucy's flap to ambush me. But nothing came. My hand didn't leave the knife I'd placed on my pillow for a second, though. I was ashamed. I felt like I'd let myself down. Like a frightened child calling out to his parents in the night. I felt like I had to talk to someone, to get out of my own head. I summoned all my courage and decided to stay another night, getting over my childlike fear of the dark. So that's exactly what I did. It's a good thing I was already on my way to my makeshift toilet, because what I saw when leaving my tent that morning would have caused my bowels to evacuate faster than a house on fire. The rabbit, which was so merrily hopping around my tent that previous night, was dead. Cut in half, in fact, and left at the base of the isolated tree. I couldn't look at it for too long. It was making me feel ill. How could I have not heard it? It didn't make any sense. How could I have heard it hopping around but not hear it getting sliced apart? Whatever did it must have been bigger than a rabbit, so surely it would have made some noise. I assumed it was some sort of bird of prey nesting in the tree that killed it, and it must have fell. That's really the only plausible explanation. I decided to kill time by having a look around the surrounding area. Like I said, I've never been camping before on my own, so I had no idea how to pass the time. So I decided to go for a quick explore. And what do you think I saw? You guessed it. More trees. There are a few interesting things though. For example, I had only walked about 30 feet or so before I stumbled upon a large, perfectly spherical black rock. It was about the size of your average football, nesting itself atop another large rock. This rock was similar to the first. It was black and smooth, but it resembled more of a cuboid than that of a sphere. A strange feeling washed over me. Had I got myself lost? This was an extremely similar formation to the one I had seen yesterday, but I had gone the opposite way from my camp. I ran back through the brush to where I assumed the other formation was. Luckily, I found it. I let out a sigh of relief, realizing I'd gone completely insane. I was intrigued now, though. I started wandering around the edge of the clearing, looking for more of these formations. I managed to find 2 more. There was one to the north of the camp, one to the east, one to the south, and one to the west. I'll admit I should have been more wary, but I thought nothing of it and moved on. Besides, the darkness was creeping in again, so I want to get back to camp, back to safety. Darkness had well and truly come. It was awful. I wanted to leave, get back to my home, but I'd never find the way. The darkness had literally enveloped my camp. It was heavy, thick, and suffocating. The silence was back as well. Something was different about tonight. It was hard to put my finger on it. I had this overwhelming sense of dread. The fire was much smaller than last night as well, so I felt even more blind. The feeling of helplessness was getting me to panic, and it was taking hold. So I decided to have a little look around and see if there was anything of interest. I've never seen an owl before, so I was scanning the trees, seeing if anything caught my eyes. As I was scanning the tree line, something did catch my attention. There was a dim light coming from the edge of the clearing, roughly about 30 feet away from me. My peripheral vision just about managed to pick it up. I strained my neck to see what it was, but unfortunately, it sunk back into the darkness. I hoped for some reason it would be another person. My naivety was getting to me. Another speck of light appeared. I could only see it in my peripheral vision as I turned my head, but it was roughly 90 degrees away from the first one. Again, I turned to look, but I couldn't see it anymore. Wild thoughts started running through my head at this point. Who were these people? What were they doing out here? And what did they want from me? I even began to wonder if it was the rock formations that were somehow emitting light, but I dismissed that. I had another scan of the tree line, and my heart stopped. It was hard to make out exactly what it was, what I thought I saw, since I only caught it for a brief moment. There appeared to be a silhouette of a person peering out from behind the tree. The lone tree which I had chosen to camp with. As soon as I looked at it, it disappeared, sneaking back behind the tree. I leaped out of my chair. My heart was racing, my limbs felt like jelly. Jesus, I was a mess. I felt all the blood rush out my head. I decided the best thing to do was to turn back to my tent and try to get some sleep. I turned towards the tent, and I nearly blacked out. There was another one peering out from behind it. Again, I only caught it for a brief second, but it was much closer than the last one. I couldn't make out any features, it was just a black humanoid mass. The thing was dark, darker than anything I had seen before. It seemed to emanate hatred and anger in the same way that at the time I must have been emanating fear. I ran into my tent, pulled the sleeping bag over my head, and tried to sleep. Sunlight was burning my unopened eyes. I opened them, dazed, confused, delirious. It took me a few seconds to remember where I was, but my surroundings were off. I wasn't lying down. I was leaning against something. It took me a moment, but I eventually realized what was wrong. I was still in my sleeping bag, but I wasn't in my tent. Frightened, I looked around. My heart felt like it was about to explode. It was beating so fast. My tent was dead ahead of me. The flap was ripped open and some of my stuff strewn about the clearing. It finally dawned on me. I realized where I'd woken up. I turned my head upwards towards the sky and confirmed my fears. I was sat at the base of the tree. I sprung up to my feet. I was blind with terror at this point. There, sticking out of the tree, was my knife. Carved into the tree was one word. Leave. And that's exactly what I did. I took a drive through the woods that ended someplace strange. By first breath 1. My father died on Tuesday afternoon. Heart attack. My mother called with the news that evening. I lived 10 hours away at university at the time. I promised her I wouldn't do it. She even told me then that the trip could be dangerous. But immediately after my mother hung up the phone, I hopped in the car, pulled down the windows of my old Jeep Wrangler, and started the 10-hour drive home. The trip took me through the dark, lonely roads of Pennsylvania, in the middle of the night. I didn't plan it well. I left at 10. A massive storm overtook most of the northeast by 10:30. Ice-cold rain blanketed the highways. Yellow jacket police officers directed traffic through incoming lanes and outgoing floods. Traffic on the local roads added another hour to my timeline. The darkness and lack of proper lighting probably tacked on another towards the end. I barely knew where I was going. I never drove this far before. Panic crept in like a leech in the back of my brain. Self-doubt pushed the bug a little bit further. But the old-fashioned Garmin GPS on my dusty dash pointed towards home, and I had to. I had to trust it to do the rest. I cursed through even red light and lane change. I sung along to Spotify to relieve some angst. I tapped on my wheel like a drummer, all the while trying to keep my growing anxiety at bay. And then, finally, mercifully, after the miserable, unbearable first hour, the traffic split. The road split and opened up to an empty highway. And then I felt free. The rain pounded my windshield like a battering ram all the way down the empty pine tree-lined road. The windshield wipers on my Jeep worked overtime just to keep the windows clean. I knew I shouldn't drive so fast. I knew I should slow down. It felt terrifying, to be honest. My wheels slipped and skidded more times than a few. But I didn't care. I didn't care about anything. The only thing that mattered to me was home. Simple as that. I needed to see my mother. I needed to make sure she was okay. I needed to see my brothers who were still young and would not understand what just happened. I needed to see my family. I needed to be with them. And, as corny as it may sound to extenuate myself further, I was not going to let a godforsaken shithole of a storm take that away from me. Well, it rains and it pours when you're out on your own, my playlist agreed. If I crash on the couch, can I sleep in my clothes? I rocked along to all my favorite playlists for the first leg of the trip. But the damn cell phone died just after midnight. The lack of music left me with only the steady rain to, think about my thoughts. I despised the prospect. I turned to the radio instead. I was somewhere in the sticks, somewhere outside Harrisburg by that point. The shitty weather and lack of reception limited my options to 2 stations. One of them was at commercial break, so I settled for the second. I recognized the horrible drone of the local radio almost immediately.
Welcome back. This is 96 FM Radio Nowhere. We are your one-stop shop for late-night talk. We're again located at 96.3 on your FM dial and are humbly serving the proud folks of the absolutely awe-inspiring Tanner Falls. Do consider looking at our website and do consider donating. Now that that's all out of our way, let's take our first caller. Who do we have on the line, Margaret?
It didn't take long to realize that I should have brought my own CD case.
Okay, Margaret tells me she's back to live one. We've got Jim from Mother Teresa Avenue on the line. Jim, talk to me.
The passing storm caused the frequency to shift up a bit. I could hear tones of Home Sweet Home from probably some distant city over Jim's heartfelt confession. I turned the dial to get it back, but Radio Fuckface only became clearer.
I wanted to talk about something the whole town's thinking about, and I haven't heard it mentioned on your show yet, Stephen.
My ears perked. The road dipped and rose through the hills.
Go ahead. I'm listening. We're all listening, son.
Jim paused.
Do you think the killer will strike again tonight?
The host whooped over the air. Jim spoke with the nervousness of a man who knew he would be cut off at any moment.
Twice in the past 2 weeks, Stephen. Always on Friday. Always in the night. These animals follow patterns. When are we going to do something? Do we wait for 3 for the FBI to get involved?
The host spoke quietly for a few moments out of earshot. To, I suppose, Margaret, before he came back to the microphone and spoke quietly.
Okay, now we've disconnected the caller. I want to take a moment to answer him honestly. We said we wouldn't talk about this. We don't want to talk about this. We don't want to bring attention and glory to this. But I can understand why people want some reassurance.
I don't remember the details here. It felt like hitting a patch of black ice. My Jeep T-boned a guardrail and landed a somersault right side up. The wreck left me confused and stunned off the side of the road. But I was all right. My car, not so much.
I turned the engine. Nothing happened. No whine, no whinny, just a couple cracked displays and an all-too-familiar cackle of the radio. I remember it continuing when I came to.
People like to remember the New Testament God, the God of forgiveness and sunshine and rosary and heaven on earth. They forget the wrath. They forget Genesis. Well, let me tell you, caller, the Lord has made a place for this cretin, and the people of Tanner Falls will send him to the place where vengeance is best made, below. We've already dug his grave.
My airbag deployed in my face. The second wave of shock shook my head and made it more dizzy than the accident itself.
I don't mean to get to fire and brimstone, folks. This stuff really brings it out of you. Everyone in town knows the brutality involved in these cases. Everyone in town knows somebody affected. Please stay safe. Once again, we're advising folks to stay off the local roads past dark, and to please avoid picking up hitchhikers on Highway 26.
I opened up my door and surveyed the remains of my crumbled Jeep. I looked down the dark highway. A sign a few yards away read the next exit. You guessed it. Highway 26. Shit. Shit. That phrase hung in my mind like a panicked prayer. I dug through my back seat for the charger I knew wasn't there. I looked in my trunk for it too, checked my glove box, seat backs, even that annoying spot between the cushions. Nothing. I turned the engine over a few times just to check that too. No luck. The clock on my dash read midnight. Radio Nowhere turned back in with the flailing battery.
Looks like we're out of time for tonight, folks. Margaret, little foxy wench that she is, has left me high and dry. Looks like I'm closing shop solo tonight. I'd like to end our broadcast with an extended heartfelt be safe to all the folks of Tanner. Though we walk in the shadow of evil, we shall not fear it. Boa noite, bon nuit, buona notte. Good night.
The station returned to static. I sat in the driver's seat like a trapped little animal. My options dwindled with the temperatures that must have been well below freezing by that point. I could get out and walk. The GPS pointed to a gas station 30 miles east, but that route took me right through the supposed hunting ground. Or I could wait in the car where I was safe and locked. But then I became a sitting duck. As the rain slowly transitioned to snow, I unfortunately settled for the latter. Something about the drift of static and warm air from the heater made the car surprisingly comfortable. Sleep didn't happen at first. For the first hour, I surveyed the endless trees and wilderness around me. I thought maybe it would be cool to see a bear or a wolf or something different in the distance. The car would at least protect me from that. I dreamt of an entire zoo's worth of animals surrounding my car and peeking inside harmlessly. Truthfully, I never expected what came next. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of metal being scraped against metal. My contacts were still in, thank God for that. But they did that thing where they slid to the back of your eye so you lose focus. I took a few moments to rub and gather my sight before looking out through the windshield into the lonely road ahead of me. The snow was the first and only thing I could see at first. 2 inches at least on the roads and probably 4 in the woods around me. The visibility dropped to about 20 feet. It took a moment, but the source of the sound became clear, and when it did, somebody was standing in the road. I tried to flash my lights at them, but my battery was dead, so it only came out in a flicker. I could barely see anything. The walls of white stood between me and the mystery figure. He or she had to be about 50 feet away. They wore a heavy coat. They had a mask of some kind, and they held something long in their hand, something that dragged against the gravel to produce that uncomfortable noise, but I couldn't tell what. The figure stood tall and straight like an arrow. Then they fell to the ground and flattened out in the snow. The pose of these two movements sent a shiver down my spine. I fumbled for the lock just to make sure it worked. I lay down flat, trying to hide. It didn't work. The figure stood up again. Then it charged. From 50 feet away, the shadow ran towards me at full speed, and I didn't know what to do. I knew this could be the killer from the radio. I knew I could be the next victim. I knew all of these things, and in my mind that leech of panic reached around to grab every lobe and stem it could find. A large object collided with the hood of my car. I leaned up to see a flail smack down on my windshield. He pulled the round cylindrical ball back with his chain and struck it down on my mirror. I screamed for somebody, anybody to help, but there was nobody around. The figure in front of me pulled the flail back one more time. I could see the mask more clearly now. It was a pig's face, one of those freaky ones with the hair and all. The sick fuck leaned into the passenger mirror and stared at me with that freakish mask, like it was trying to look into my eyes. Then he leaned back. I jumped to the passenger seat and backed away as the flail came through the window and sent bits of shattered glass through the cabin. I knew I was going to die. A gloved hand reached into my beleaguered car and pulled back the lock. The killer opened the door slowly. It was as if he enjoyed this part more than any other. They must have thought they had me. They must have thought they were done. It must have looked like a cat cornering a mouse. But there was one thing the killer didn't consider, and it's pure dumb luck they didn't. The car had 4 doors. 4 doors. 4 exits. Pig man or lady pulled angrily at the psychopathic device wedged into my hood on the driver's side. They were distracted. Now was my chance. I popped out the passenger door, fell into the snow, and sprinted into the woods like the devil himself was behind me. Maybe he was. My son brought something home from the woods. Written by Harrison Prince. My husband and I always wanted our son to be adventurous. We wanted to watch him grow up asking questions about everything, seeking out answers and looking for adventure. It seems like whenever parents have a deep desire for how they want their children to be, their children instinctively know and go in the complete opposite direction. As Sam grew up, he became very introverted and would actively ask when it was time for bed. He loved to sleep, and our doctor gave a lot of explanations. All the illnesses had been checked and crossed out before he said, "I think he just likes to get away from reality. He likes his dreams more than he enjoys his life." This was at the age of 8. This actually depressed us as parents. What could be so wrong, so uninteresting about his life that he would want to come home and just sleep? The doctor recommended that we plan family activities that were geared towards him as a way to engage him in life, and give him something to be excited about after school. So, for our very first trip, we decided to go on a hike. The mountains were about an hour away, and we considered this a mild introduction to our new family habit. When we told Sam what we were doing, he was ecstatic. We knew then that hiking had been the right activity. On Saturday, we threw together some backpacks, lunch, water, and even a magnifying glass so Sam could inspect everything closely. He was so excited the entire way there. We were all thrilled. When we parked at the trailhead, Sam leapt out of the car and almost ran up to the trail without us. We had to call him back so we could keep an eye on him. The hike was short, maybe half a mile, but Sam tried to run it like a marathon. We kept calling for him to come back and check out this bird or this butterfly or the log that looked like Grandpa's face. He would come and look to humor us, but then run ahead. Eventually, we gave up trying to point out things and let him just run through the woods. We were pleased that it had taken so well to the trip. For once, Charlie and I felt like we were doing the right thing as parents. Anyone who's a parent knows how that feels. We got to the end of the trail and ate our lunch. We were at a ledge along the mountain that was more like a hill.
The sun was high overhead, and we could see over the trees for miles. Sam quickly downed his lunch, and we let him run off into the trees. "Not too far," I warned him. He obeyed, and we could always see him. From the rocks where we sat, I watched Sam whilst Charlie went to the bathroom. I watched Sam pick up sticks, swing them at bushes and tree trunks until the stick broke, then pick up another one. He picked up one that was too short to be swung, but he smiled wide at it and ran around with it in front of him, using both hands. Finally, he ran over to me and said, "Mom, feel this stick! It feels so cool!" "Oh yeah?" I grinned, taking the stick from him. It was in the shape of a Y, and when I grabbed one of the sides of the Y, it was perfectly smooth. It looked like someone had taken a knife and whittled a bigger branch down into the smooth, slingshot-shaped stick. The two sides of the Y were curved, almost like bicycle handbars. "It's very smooth," I said to encourage him. He looked at me funny, then ran back into the woods to keep playing. We packed up lunch, stuffed everything back into the backpacks, and announced that we were ready to hike back. Sam came back without a fuss, and we began walking down the trail. Instead of running ahead, Sam lagged behind, still clutching the Y-stick. He held it in front of him with both hands as before and was swinging it around slowly, as if it were a magnifying glass and he was searching for something. "Come on, Sam," Charlie encouraged gently when he stood in one place for too long. We both had to stop because he had fallen so far behind. He was pointing his stick to this tree, arms outstretched. He kept looking from the stick to the trees as if to try to line something up. We both waited patiently for a few seconds, but the heat was getting to us and we were both ready for an air-conditioned car. "Sam, honey, let's go," I called. "Okay," he called back, but didn't move. Charlie sighed and walked back to him. He put his hands on both of Sam's shoulders and guided him down the trail. The whole time, Sam kept both hands firmly on the stick and tried his best to point it back towards the trees where he'd been looking. He didn't point it towards where he'd been standing, I noticed later, but at a spot past the trail into the trees, always at one position. Charlie finally got him to where I was, and we kept walking. Sam eventually stopped pointing his stick and instead kept it down in front of him, both hands still being used to hold on to either side of the Y. We drove home, pleased that Sam was taking home a souvenir. Our day trip had worked. He was getting involved with life. We were one step closer to having our adventurous son. Over the next couple days, lots of things started happening. They all seemed disjointed and not connected in the moment. Later, memory would connect them for me. Sam went back to his sleeping routine. He would come home from school, go to his room, and play for a bit by himself while dinner was being made. I got him to work on homework, then served him dinner while Charlie got home. After that, he went straight to bed by his own choice. This wasn't abnormal for him, so I wasn't more concerned than usual. A few nights after we got home, I noticed that Sam's bedroom light was on even though he'd gone to bed hours ago. His door was closed, so I went to go turn off his light for him. I figured he might have left it on when he fell asleep or something. The second I opened the door, Sam leapt off the floor and jumped into bed like he was in trouble. It was only 7 in the evening. I wasn't going to yell at him for not going to bed when he said he was. His rapid jump into bed had me worried, though. "Sam? What's up?" "Nothing," he said in that kiddish tone that screams, "I didn't do anything." I looked around the room and saw what I always saw. His toys were out and lined in some game he must have been playing. Nothing was out of place or irregular. You jumped up as soon as I came in. Anything wrong?"
"No."
"Okay," I said slowly, unsure of what else to say. He looked at me with untold terror in his eyes. "Are you sure there's nothing wrong?" I pressed. "I can hang out with you for a bit if you want." He stared right through me, his eyes wide. It took him a few seconds to reply. "No, Mother. I'm going to bed now. Can you turn out the light?" I blinked. He's never called me Mother in his life. I should have pushed myself in and sat on his bed and talked until he admitted what was wrong. But I didn't. Charlie called my name and distracted me. I wished him a good night and turned off the light and shut the door. Talking later on with Charlie about it, Charlie thought that maybe he had somehow discovered masturbation even at his young age.
"And you rub around on the floor the right way, it just happens,"
Charlie told me. Apparently that was how he had discovered it. So I chalked the situation up to that. Sam also kept carrying around that Y stick everywhere. He always kept it within reach. During dinner, he kept it on the table. When I told him that sticks don't belong on the dining room table, he kept it on his chair next to him. He took it to bed and kept it next to his head. He even took it to school. I tried fighting him on it once, but he claimed he was taking it to show and tell. I was about to insist that he leave it at home, but he looked like he might cry if I came down firm. So I let him, on the condition that if his teacher mentioned it to me, that I'd make him leave it at home. He agreed. One day, Charlie was taking out the garbage and the bag caught on the door jamb. The contents of the bag spilled all over the floor and he quietly cursed and went to get another bag. That was when we found about 20 of Sam's toys in the trash. They varied from stuffed animals to action figures. Confused, Charlie asked me if I'd thrown them away or was punishing Sam for something. I told him no and was equally puzzled. Sam, for some unknown reason, had been throwing away his own toys. Together, after dinner, we sat down with Sam at the table to ask him about the toys. We saw it as a cry for help. "They were selected," he said in response. "They weren't doing a good enough job, so they were fired. Their time was up." Charlie told Sam that we don't throw toys away because they cost money and we don't waste things. Sam nodded, but I saw his hands clutch the side of the Y-stick tightly under the table. He was stressing. Something was going on. We ended the conversation on a light note, and Sam understood why we were upset. He promised not to throw away any more toys, then ran off to bed. I just remember thinking how strange the sentence was. Their time was up. That was an adult's line, not something you hear from kids. Sam's school sent an email to all the parents about 2 weeks after our hiking trip. The principal pleaded with parents to not let their children come to school if their child was sick, as there was a very serious flu going around the school. He even admitted that 5 teachers and 30 students had been sick over the last week alone. I showed it to Charlie. He didn't find it as weird as I did.
"Hand sanitizer breeds superbugs," he shrugged. "Just tell Sam to wash his hands more often."
The final straw came from the few nights later. It was a Wednesday night when I woke up for no reason. Charlie was snoring next to me, but in a lull between snores, I heard a whisper. Fear seized my throat and I lifted my head off the pillow slowly to peer at the bedroom door. Something moved in the dark, stumbling along. Someone small and short. Sam. Irritated, I got up and walked towards the door. I saw Sam skip away as if we were crossing a field of spiders and was desperate not to get any on his shoes. "Sam!" I whispered, walking out after him. I turned the corner into my family room, but he wasn't there. I heard bare feet race across the kitchen floor, and that made me angry. The little shit was hiding from me. I walked through the family room and noticed that the clock on the wall was way louder than usual. Or maybe I was hypersensitive because I was exhausted. When I entered the kitchen, Sam was facing me. He stood next to the fridge, and the small LEDs on it lit up his expression. He was terrified, and his little Y-stick was pointed right at me. "Sam?" I hissed in annoyance. "It's late. Go back to bed." "I need water," he said, still looking at me with wide eyes. It was an obvious lie, but one not abnormal for kids past their bedtime. "Okay, then get some water." "Can you get it?" he asked, still clutching the stick and pointing it my way. He must have seen my mum look, because he re-emphasized, "Please." I walked forward, and that's when I noticed that he pointed the stick around me. He was pointing at something behind me. I whirled around really fast and stared into the empty darkness of the family room. The clock was still noticeably loud. It sounded like a person saying the actual words. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I looked around the room for a full 30 seconds. Nothing moved. "What are you up to, Sam?" I asked, turning back to face him. He looked at me with real, true terror in his eyes. The stick was shaking in his hands. "Sam!" I hissed, snapping a bit. "It's not time yet," he stuttered, barely glancing at me. His gaze was transfixed beyond me. "I'm not ready yet." For half a second, I wondered if he was pretending to sleepwalk. Then I wondered if he actually was sleepwalking. Then my tiredness washed over me and I got irritable again. "It's time for bed," I insisted, walking towards him. Still, he keeps his eyes behind me, and the stick pointed into the family room. Okay, he said, defeated as I approached. He took slow, unwilling steps towards the family room. I stood behind him, watching to make sure he went to bed. I saw his head look back and forth, scanning the room as he entered. He was looking for something. He looked back at me with uncertainty. Suddenly he screamed. I instinctively whirled around, hands up, ready to attack whatever was there. Nothing. Nothing but the darkness and the far kitchen wall. I ground my teeth and glared down at him. He was still shaking, pointing his stick into the empty kitchen. I was beyond annoyed now. The stick had been out of control for weeks. "I think you need a break from this," I said, snatching the stick from his hand. "No, no!" he screeched. Sam practically leapt at me, but I jumped out of the way. This was the only way, I assured myself. This stick wasn't healthy after all. Don't! He cried and yelled, following me through the family room into the hall. All the attention that he'd pointed into the kitchen was now directed at me. He tried to jump and grab at the stick, but I held it above my head. I felt like a teenage older sibling teasing my younger brother, but this was necessary. But I pushed my way into my room, tossed the stick onto the floor, and turned back to get Sam out. Give it to me! Give it to me! he demanded without taking a breath. I pushed him out and shut the bedroom door. I flipped the lock on the handle and sighed.
"What's going on?" Charlie mumbled.
I took the stick away. He was playing with it all night, I sighed, coming back to bed. Sam was pounding on the door. I convinced Charlie that we should ignore him, let him tire himself out, and tomorrow we would lecture him. He verbally agreed, though I could sense he didn't agree inside. It took an hour, but Sam gave up, and we went to sleep. The next morning, my throat felt like I swallowed sandpaper. The flu, of course. My stomach rumbled and roused me out of bed. I found myself running to the master bedroom after my stomach turned nauseous. I puked up spaghetti from dinner the night before. Stumbling out of the bathroom, I had moved aside for Charlie, who couldn't make it to the toilet and threw up into the sink. "Not you too," I sighed sympathetically.
"I haven't been this sick since I was a kid," he moaned, rinsing out his mouth. I rubbed my eyes, still tired from Sam's ordeal last night, and got into the shower with the lights off, hoping it would help my light sensitivity. Charlie decided to call in sick for the rest of the day. I got ready for the day so I wouldn't lounge around in my pajamas all day, feeling even more sick. When I was completely ready, I unlocked the bedroom door and stepped out. Sam was nowhere in sight, which meant he had gone back to bed. Good. "Sam, I hope you're ready for school," I said loudly. No reply. I went to his room and found the door shut as usual. I twisted the handle and pushed, but the door was stuck. "The hell?" I muttered quietly. Using my shoulder, I shoved hard against the door. I heard a clatter, then the door opened. As I entered, I saw three things right away. 1. A chair had been placed under the door handle, preventing it from opening easily. 2. The window was wide open, with the screen missing. And 3. Sam wasn't in his room. We called the police immediately after searching the house from top to bottom. If we hadn't called them, I had no idea where we would have started. Should we have driven around looking for him? Called his friends' houses to see if they knew where he was? The police were helpful, and I spent a miserable half day sitting by the phone, puking my guts out and worrying about Sam. The police were driving around, searching for Sam with his picture taped to their dashboards. Charlie was dead asleep when I wandered into the bedroom, debating lying down. But I couldn't sleep while Sam was missing. The sickness would let me, of course, but the guilt of falling asleep whilst this was going on was too much. I saw the stick, which had landed partially under the bed when I threw it last night. All because of this stick. Maybe the doctor was wrong. Maybe he did have something wrong with him, but it was mental, psychological. Maybe instead of a doctor, we should have taken him to a psychologist. In an attempt to stay awake, I decided to search my house for the 15th time. This time, I carried the stick with me. "Sam," I said, loud enough to be heard whilst I was walking through the family room, kitchen, and to the stairs. Maybe he was hiding in the storage room downstairs. Maybe behind a few boxes. "Sam!" I said again. "I have your stick. I'm sorry I took it. Please come out. Mummy's really worried. You aren't in trouble." I descended the stairs, and halfway down, I thought I heard him reply. It was faint, far away. The words were impossible to make out. "Sam!" I cried desperately.
spinning around on the stairs to try and figure out if he was upstairs or downstairs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a leg dart around the corner at the bottom of the stairs, towards the storage room. My hunch was correct. I sped down the stairs and turned the corner. The door was closed. I twisted the handle, but he had locked it. "Sam, oh honey, open the door, please," I pleaded whilst reaching for the key at the bottom of the door frame. He didn't unlock the door. I stuck the key in and twisted. The door popped open to reveal our pitch-black storage room. The room was in the middle of the house and had no windows. It contained a water heater and control systems for the heat and AC. The room was so large, though, that Charlie had built shelves for us to keep our seasonal decorations, our camping supplies, and extra food and water. "Sam?" I said more quietly, feeling uneasy. Something about this room was getting to me. "How does the clock tick, Mother?" Sam said from somewhere in the room. I froze. The word mother made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something's not right. Something's not right. "Sam, come out now," I stuttered. Light spilled in from the doorway, but it didn't illuminate enough of the room for me to search. I slowly stepped towards the center of the room where the string hung down from a single light bulb in the ceiling. With one hand, I kept a hold of the stick. With the other, I reached out to search for the string. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was somewhere. Suddenly the door slammed shut, and at that exact instant, my hand brushed against hair. Long, greasy hair at shoulder height. Sam wasn't that tall. The hair was tangled and long. I yelped and jumped back, startled by the door and the hair simultaneously. "Do you know how the clock ticks?" It came from my left, along the wall. The hair had been to my right. What else was in here with us? I was paralyzed. I couldn't see a damn thing. My phone was upstairs, so I couldn't use that as a flashlight. The ceiling light was somewhere in front of me, and the door was somewhere behind me. Every time I started to reach out, I remembered touching the greasy hair and recoiled. "Charlie!" I called upwards, hoping he could hear me, hoping he was awake. Tick-tock, tick-tock, Sam said again, my brain instantly remembering the sound the clock had made the night before. It was the same voice. Faintly a voice, and faintly background noise at the same time. "Sam," my voice hoarsely whispered. I had to throw up again. I swallowed bile and felt one more time for the string. It brushed my hand, and I jumped back before realizing it was string, not greasy hair. Resolutely, I launched my hand out and grabbed at the string. It swung into my hand and I yanked it down, hard. The single bulb buzzed to life and something moved to my right. I screamed at the top of my lungs when I saw white and black. It's taken me a long time to place the shape, but now I'm certain. A deer's skull partially covered by stringy hair darted away from the light, circling behind me. In absolute terror, I squeezed my eyes shut and didn't dare to open them. In the battle for fight or flight, I turned into an ostrich, burying my head and hoping it didn't see me. I started sobbing. I wanted to run for the door, but I was too scared to open my eyes. "Mummy?" Sam called from my left. I didn't respond. I was sobbing too hard. "Mummy, help, I'm stuck." Very, very slowly, I moved one finger and looked to the side. Sam was huddled up on the top shelf. I couldn't see his face, but I saw jeans and his favorite shirt. Calm down and let's go. I can't. It's going to get me. I tried hard not to sob again. Come and get me, please, he begged. I fought through the terror and stepped towards the shelf, still covering my face and using a small gap in my fingers to navigate. When I reached the shelf, I closed my eyes and held out my arms. Climb into my arms, Sam. I'll get you down and we'll go get your dad. My voice broke at the end. I'm stuck. My shirt is caught. Okay, I said, trying to be brave for him. Guide my hand where it is and I'll let you loose. He paused. It's at the back of the shelf. You can't reach. I bit my lip to stop it trembling. With both eyes closed, I placed my hand on the top shelf and my foot on the bottom shelf. The stick was placed on the shelf so I could use both my hands. I hoisted myself up so I could reach and balanced precariously. Where is it, honey? I asked, refusing to open my eyes. Reach here, he said, and I could feel him rotate so I could reach over him. I did, and my hand ran straight into a mess of tangled, greasy hair. My eyes opened in shock. It stared back at me for only a millisecond. In that millisecond, it spoke, not with words, but in my head.
Do you know how the clock ticks? It is fed by death.
The shelf under my feet collapsed, and as I fell, my hands pulled the shelf until it toppled over, coming down on top of me. I woke up in the hospital, much to Charlie and Sam's relief. It was a tumult of information and questions. They asked why I was down there, and instead of sounding insane, I said that I'd been searching for Sam again just in case. Sam had been found walking on the road in the general direction of a hiking spot. It wasn't very far, thankfully, and was unharmed. When Charlie practically yelled, asking why the hell he had been in the middle of the night alone, Sam said he needed to find another stick to stop the monsters. The police were, of course, recommending that he talk to a psychologist. They'd overheard the conversation. Charlie didn't wake up until the police were at our door with Sam in hand. That was about an hour after the shelf collapsed on me. Sam and Charlie had gone through the house looking for me, and found me under the collapsed shelving. The police had been right there, thankfully, and rushed me off to the hospital. Some of my ribs were broken, and so was my left leg. The shelf that had collapsed on me had held the camping tent and the fake Christmas tree, and a few other half-empty boxes. I was lucky it wasn't the food storage shelf. The door was locked when they got to it, and the key wasn't in the lock, so they had to break it down. The second Sam saw the scene, he apparently stood over me in a protective stance, looking all around. Charlie left to get the police before they left upstairs. A couple of days after I got released from the hospital, and Charlie had recovered from the flu that had knocked him off his feet, I got to talk to Sam. I asked him outright what had been going on. It only took a few minutes of him denying anything was wrong. I saw the monsters, I admitted, which a parent really shouldn't do to their child. You did? He asked incredulously. I nodded. You and Dad never saw them before. When did you see them? Them? I asked nervously. Sam told me what had been happening for the last few weeks. He stumbled upon the stick, literally tripping over it. It had spoken to him, and he took it to play with it. Whenever he had the stick, he could see the monsters. They were scary, but they stayed away when I pointed the stick at them. A few of them had followed us home, walking alongside us on the trail. They came into the house at night and snuck around. They came into Sam's room, our room, everywhere. They told me that someone had to die. They told me that you had to die. So he offered the toy sacrifices to the monsters to satiate their hunger, but they were unsatisfied. Whenever I didn't have the stick, I could feel them try to grab me, but they stayed away whenever I had the stick. They kept telling me that your time was up. Whose time? Yours, Mummy. They sat with him at night and chanted tick-tock at him. They tried to convince him to put the stick down. They tried to offer him candy that the big blurry man pulled out of the air. At school, they followed him and said they would hurt people until he put the stick away. 5 teachers and 30 students got the flu while they threatened that. He held onto the stick as often as he could and patrolled the house at night to keep them out of my room. That was until I took the stick. Apparently, he grabbed the stick from the skeleton in the woods. It looked like an animal skeleton. He had seen another one just like it when he had got the first one. So he was going to go back and get the second one so the monsters would stop smiling. One had followed him on the street, he said. But now, they were all gone. And after looking through the mess of collapsed shelving, so was the stick. Sam told his psychologist about our conversation. His psychologist told me very angrily that I should not have admitted anything like that because it fed to his delusions. He was being looked at for possible schizophrenia. I'm thinking I should be tested too. How else do I explain everything that happened? One detail stands out that I can't explain. I had unlocked the door to the storage room and left the key in the handle. So why was the key found dangling from the light bulb string?
Auspicious by Tawawe. Finally, we'd been waiting all year. Through the arduous winter, tumultuous spring, and scorching midsummer, to the desperate late summer stretch. Around this time every year, my wife, Kate, and I, along with a few friends of ours, all go up to my friend Tom's cottage. It was the perfect time of year. The days were long, the nights were warm, and the bugs were damn near non-existent. For reasons I won't get into, most of us hadn't seen each other since almost the last trip. It was a balm to see each other again. In total, it would be Kate, Crystal, and her elderly pooch Duke, Dennis, Tom, Kurt, and I. Normally our friend Evan would join us. It was always a pleasure to have him with us, as he was always down for a long and action-packed night. Unfortunately, he was still away, tree planting far out west, which he did for most of the summer. Nonetheless, we were all super excited to get together and let loose before the trees began to turn and the air began to chill. On Tom's property there were 2 buildings and an outhouse. One was the main cottage, the other was a frame, where Crystal, Kurt, and Duke would sleep. Dennis, Tom, Kate, and I would all stay at the main cabin, which was quite spacious. Our friend Evan would always bring this terrible piss-water beer called Auspicious Ale. I think the 2 culminating factors of why he loved it so much were the name, strange as it was, and the price. It was unapologetically dirt cheap.
We'd all begin the trip with our own beer, wine, and liquor, but in the end, we'd all end up drinking auspicious. We'd also do stupid stuff with them, like launch them from the fire pit, or shotgun them. In Evan's absence, Dennis brought a case of auspicious, partially as a homage, but more so as a joke, I think. The cottage week was off to a great start. Swimming, kayaking, and general adventure during the day. Bonfires, board games, and general shenanigans at night. Drinking all the while. As was somewhat of a tradition, we would get the fire really built up in the evening, and find an old log with a rotted out core to toss on top of the fire. As it eventually caught the flames and started to burn from the inside out, we would shake up an auspicious and drop it in the center upside down. It was a roulette as to when it would go off, but eventually it would shoot out like a sudsy rocket. Then we'd scramble to try and find the smoky can and drink whatever hot remnants were inside, depending on how drunk we really were. This time there was enough for Dennis, Tom, and I, and we taped the ceremonial drinking of the smoky auspicious. We sent it to Evan, to let him know the tradition still survived. We never got a response, though. We had all joked and japed about how much better this was than city living. It certainly beats waiting 20 minutes for a bus that may not even exist every morning, I exclaimed to a group of nodding heads and smiling faces as we cooked over the coals and pounded through the auspicious ales. Later that night, as the wee hours of the morning were approaching, Duke, whose bedtime had already passed, but had found sleep by the fireside, roused in an agitated temper. He kept staring off into the woods behind the A-frame completely still for a few moments, before he would huff and puff in a squirrely fashion. Crystal said it was late, past Duke's bedtime, and late enough for her too. Crystal took Duke to the A-frame with Kurt following shortly after. Kate went inside the main cottage to get a midnight snack and read for a bit by candlelight before bed. Dennis, Tom, and I joked about what was in the forest, supposing it was some sort of hodag, Sasquatch, or Wendigo. The idea led us to start telling spooky stories, trying to freak each other out. It's not always easy to do, especially on the spot, but in the dark and silent night, it wasn't too hard to make everything sound scary. After I was told a story about a shape-stealing changeling, which ended with a jump scare, we all had a good laugh. We laughed hard and loud until something big rustled in the bushes. It was that same spot that Duke kept staring at, behind the A-frame. The lights inside of it were still on, so we knew Crystal and Kurt were still awake, and if nothing was bothering them, it couldn't have been significant anyways. We brushed it off. The next day we decided to be productive. We all went on a bit of a hike and cleared an old trail that led to another nearby property. It was a bit buggier than we'd hoped, but there was a small marsh, so it wasn't a big surprise. It was a bit of a roundabout trail. It started to the west of the main cottage, near where we had parked the cars, and ended on the northeast side of the property behind the A-frame. Strangely, the path was more and more cleared closer to the A-frame. It looked like several trees had been uprooted, then replanted farther back in the brush. Tom guessed it had something to do with his family, who had been up recently. They probably did some work up here. Maybe they started clearing the trail too, but gave up or decided not to clear it the whole way. It made sense, but the replanting didn't. What about this? I asked as I held up an old can of auspicious ale, crumpled and muddied from having been weathered. Maybe from last year, Tom said uncertainly. Although I remember it was cleaning up pretty well, and since then my family's been up, so someone would have picked it up. Unless they drink auspicious too. Seemed weird. We only drank it as a joke. But I guess everyone has their own tastes. Still, I couldn't help but think back to how Duke reacted to that area the night before. On the last day of our great northern vacation, we were sorting everything out, packing up, loading the cars, taking the trash to the dump, and cleaning the cottage. Dennis drew my attention to the last few auspicious ales. I don't really want to take these home. Kinda don't want to drink them either, to be honest. Yeah, I replied. I'm all partied out now. Maybe we should do something weird with them. Why don't we bury them somewhere and try and dig them up next year? Dennis laughed. That's a great idea. We'll even have Evan with us too, so we can show him the great auspicious grave. Dennis and I wandered around the property, looking for a good spot to dig a hole. We wanted it to be deep enough so that it wouldn't freeze in the winter, bursting the cans. It had to be close enough to the cottage that we would be able to remember and find the spot, but not so close as to be in the way. After taking the trail behind the A-frame about 1.5 kilometers into the woods, we found a perfect spot, where the trail deviated towards the waterfront. We collected some distinct rocks and sticks to put over the auspicious grave and began digging. It was harder than you would think. I was surprised how gnarly and difficult it was to dig down. Tom said the land here was hard to clear anyway, a lot of large rocks and roots. Eventually, just a few feet down, we hit something that made a loud metallic crunch. Dennis and I looked at each other, confused. I sifted through the hole, unearthing a very old and disheveled can of auspicious ale. I began to try and clear away the dirt with my hand, to see that there was more in the hole. There was a strange rock, very smooth, with a large hole in it. A chill ran down my spine, and a strange knotting sensation started to build in the pit of my stomach. It couldn't be. I feverishly cleared away the dirt, clump by clump, pulling some stray roots aside. "Dude, let's just put it there. That should be deep enough. What are you scrambling around for?" Dennis muttered impatiently. That's when I cleared enough to see what was really in there. "It's a skull," I grimaced. We immediately stopped the whole process and stared into the shallow grave. The remains were not totally decomposed. You could tell because there were plenty of insects scrambling about, now that it had been unearthed. More than a little freaked out, Dennis and I went back to the cottage. After putting the shovels and auspiciouses on the front deck, we told the others about what we found. Our story was first met with disbelief, but everyone could tell deep down by the manner of which Dennis and I told them it wasn't a joke. Tom couldn't believe it. At least, he didn't want to. We took him to the corpse to show him. "We need to call the cops." We all agreed. The cops questioned us all, but it didn't feel like any of us were being accused of anything. They were definitely having a hard time believing we were trying to bury a few beers, but I can totally understand how dumb that sounds. We had little enough information to share about it. The cops told us that we had to stick around through the beginning of the investigation in case anything else came up, so we didn't return to the city. Luckily, the cottage was far enough from the crime scene they were allowed to stay there, although the police were constantly traipsing through the property to get from the main road to the corpse. A short while later, in the evening, they asked us all one by one to view the corpse, keeping us separate from each other in the meantime. Despite the decomposition, they were hoping we might be able to shed some light on its identity. They said decomposition can be a peculiar thing. By this date, it had been at least 2 months, but between Canadian weather and soil decomposition of the area, it could have been there for much longer. I was taken over third. They knew it was probably a long shot, but I think they had little enough to go on. There was something about the stature, hair, and the teeth. I recognized the corpse, or at least I thought I did. It looked just like Evan. I told the officer. I knew how crazy it was. There was no way. Evan came back with us last year. I've seen him multiple times since then. He'd been in contact, if only loosely. We did all the same things we'd normally have done together since the body was supposedly buried. Gone for drinks, watched movies in my basement, played online games. Nothing added up. We'd even been in, although sporadic, communication with him whilst he was out west planting. They didn't need to bring anyone else over to see the corpse after me. Tom, who was brought up first, identified it as Evan the same way I did. They told us until they checked the dental records, there was no way of knowing for sure. We gave the officers Evan's contact info, both his and his family's. We were told not to try contacting him, and to stay in the area for the next 2 days. At this point, I don't think any of us were happy to have our cottage stay extended.
After that, Crystal and Kurt stayed in the main cottage with the rest of us. There was more than enough room, if not just a bit less privacy all round, but I think everyone was much more content to be staying close together. The night was eerie. It was colder than it should have been. We didn't have a fire. No one was interested in hanging around outside. There was a stillness to the air. To the lake, too. It wasn't peaceful or serene. It was haunting. The next day was hardly any better. A thick fog had moved in during the early morning, and there was so much overcast that the sun could hardly chase it away. It sat blanketing the whole area, like an otherworldly cemetery. All of us were torn halfway between being in shock and completely lost in our thoughts. How could that have been Evan? There was no way. Despite all the partying we had previously done, we knew we weren't going home anytime soon. We had all spoken fairly little. The meals we had were uninspired and listless. Highly irregular for Kurt, Kate, and I, who did most of the cooking. Everything we did felt like we were merely going through the motions. Some of us, myself included, found ourselves overindulging in the remaining alcohol we had. Perhaps to try to avoid the issue. Perhaps as just something to keep ourselves occupied. No matter. It led us to trying to call Evan eventually, despite what the cops had told us. No answer. We called him several times that night with no luck. I sent him a few texts, hoping that he'd see them soon and explain that he was fine, just out in the boonies with no reception for the past week. It wouldn't have been uncommon whilst he was off planting, I rationalized to myself. It was early in the evening of the last day we were stuck up there that things started to turn grim. It felt like we hadn't seen the sun all day, and the fog was even thicker. Everyone seemed even more sapped, but we dragged ourselves into action, and had everything packed and ready to go as soon as possible. Crystal stepped out front to take Duke for a nature call, when we heard him starting to go wild. He was barking up a storm, hopping around and freaking out. I'd seen him bark before, but I've never seen him get wild like this. For an old dog, he was as close to being a savage wolf as I'd ever seen. He ran towards the A-frame, pulling the leash out of Crystal's hand. Kurt and I ran outside to see what the commotion was. As soon as Kurt saw Duke running off into the fog, he sprinted off after him, telling Crystal he'd be right back. By this point, we were standing on the wraparound porch of the cottage, yelling for both Kurt and Duke. We were all helplessly scrambled, unsure of what to do, unwilling to get lost in this fog. Duke stumbled back to the front of the cottage after what felt like an eternity later, shivering. The wolf in him was gone, and like the rest of us, he was uneasy. Unlike the rest of us, he'd seen something in the fog. We expected Kurt to come wandering back right behind him, but we weren't so lucky. I felt that same knotting sensation, a growing hole in my stomach eating away at me, telling me it was the last I'd ever see him. Tom was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands.
There's never been fog like this. Not here. Never.
Dennis suddenly jumped up in a burst of courage. I'm going to drive to town and get some help. We'll find Kurt, and then we'll get out of here. To hell with the fog, and to hell with the cops. The rest of us looked at each other, uncertain. As much as we all wanted to be out of this hellscape, there was no way anyone could drive in this. I know what you're all thinking. I won't make it back, but I have to try. We have to do something. In that, we all agreed. I'll go with you, I piped up, regretting the offer as soon as it left my lips. No, I'm taking the risk here. It's not worth any more of us getting lost. You're all better off staying here. See if you can get hold of the local cops in the meantime. Kate had been trying to call them since Kurt first ran off into the fog, but kept losing signal, alternating between using each of our phones with no luck. We stood on the porch as Dennis prepared to dash to where he remembered parking his car. None of us had dared to set foot any further, not without a damn good reason. He turned to the rest of us. I'll be back in no time. Stay safe. The hole in my stomach grew. I felt it again. I was going to lose another friend. "Don't," I spat out. He ignored me and started jogging off into the fog. We heard a car door open and slam shut. A small relief. Until a huge crash split the silence. Then the alarm on Dennis's car began blaring. Tom started towards the car, but Kate stopped him. "He'll be fine, I'm sure." "And if he's not?" Tom blurted out angrily. "Then you won't be either, if you run headlong into the fog like an idiot." Another huge crash followed, silencing the car for good. 20 minutes had passed since Dennis ran into his car. We never heard the engine start. Hope was failing. "I got through, it's ringing," Kate exclaimed. We sat in surprise, wide-eyed as she turned on the speakerphone. 911, what's your emergency? "Hello? My friends and I are trapped in a cottage west of Bracebridge. 2 of them went out into the fog and gone missing. We need help." "Ma'am, I'm going to redirect you to local law enforcement. Can you please tell me the address of the cottage?" "What's the address?" she yelled to Tom. It's a huge crash, sounding like a tree being felled, could be heard from the distance outside of the cottage. Then the line cut. Tom stopped. We all couldn't believe it. Immediately she tried redialing, but there was no service. Again. In the middle of the long, sleepless night, I was startled by Kate shaking me out of my false sleep. "I heard something in the living room," she said, reaching for the hatchet we decided to keep next to the side of her bed. I grabbed the machete on my side, and we slowly crept out of the first-floor room. It was Tom, standing by the front door, staring out into the fog. We slowly walked up closer to him before he spoke, as if he was expecting us. "We have to go out there after them. I think you should try and get some more rest, dude. We'll sort this all out in the morning." "No!" he snapped. "We need to go now!" I heard the rhythmic tapping of Duke's paw on the wooden floor. Crystal was standing a few feet behind us, staring somberly. "It's obvious we can't go out there. There's something seriously disturbing going on here. It's important we don't lose anyone else." She was right. It was a foolish notion. I'm not even sure what crossed Tom's mind. "We're gonna run out of food eventually, if not before potable water. Would it be better to die a slow death trapped inside, or attempt to find our friends and put an end to all of this?" he retorted. Somehow I didn't feel like he was being truthful. I didn't believe that he really wanted to go out there after Kurt and Dennis. "Why do you really want to go out there, Tom?" I asked, but I was met with silence. He simply put his hand to the top of the glass door, still staring into the fog. "Let's all just sit down for a second. I'll make us some tea or coffee or something." As I reached for his shoulder, he turned around and pushed me back with primal strength. I fell to the floor. I heard Kate scream, "No!" When I looked back up, Tom was gone. The door was ajar. We all sat vacantly around the dining table. We didn't speak. We couldn't even look at each other. We decided to just try and stay inside and hold out until the police came back. What other choice did we really have? After about an hour of silence, I decided to go boil some water for coffee. "What about when Duke has to go to the bathroom again?" said Kate. "We can't go any further than the porch. None of us can," I hastily responded. At this point, it was around 6 a.m. We'd pretty much stayed up all night. Other than Tom running off, it was probably the quietest night there'd been. Almost suspiciously so. I noticed at this point there was an absence of sounds in the forest. No rustling, no birds, not even the sounds of the water lapping gently on the nearby shore. Then, as if answering my thoughts out loud, there was a loud crunch, then creaking. At first I had no idea what it could have been. Then the creak grew to a groan, then a crash. It was obviously very close. A tree had fallen, and a damn big one by the sounds of it. Looking out front, we could see that it landed right over the fire pit towards the cottage, destroying the front stairs. Luckily it didn't land any further, I muttered. Another crunch. Then nothing. At about 7, as the sun should have been coming up, there was a slight lift to the fog. We could now just barely make out the way down to the fire pit. I went to the porch to see if I could make out Dennis's car and see if there was any sign of him.
"Hey, guys!"
I heard from the direction of the A-frame. The voice. That was Kurt. "Over here!" I hollered. Finally, the first bit of good news. The first bit of luck we'd had. Maybe he'd been hiding in the A-frame the whole time and decided to try and make it back to the cottage with the fog clearing up.
"Guys, where are you?"
He yelled again. Crystal came running out, tears in her eyes. Until now, she'd done a remarkable job of keeping composure since his disappearance. "Kurt, thank God!" She almost unintelligibly wailed out as she ran just ahead of me to the edge of the porch.
"Hey, guys! Guys, where are you?"
We heard again. Something wasn't quite right. "Kurt, over here, man! Where have you been? Follow the sound of my voice!" Silence once more.
"What are you scrambling for?"
We heard yelled from the same direction. It sounded off, though. It definitely wasn't Kurt. "Dennis, is that you?" Kate asked back.
"Stay safe."
Silence again. It was definitely Dennis's voice. "I don't think it's them," I said softly. We all stared off into the fog in horror. We backed towards the door, not wanting to turn away from the fog. Just as I, the last one, was entering through the doorway, I heard the bone-chilling phrase.
"Try to dig him up next year."
It was what I had said to Dennis before we decided to bury the auspicious ales. It was in my voice. We closed and locked the doors behind us and tried to cover the windows and doors with curtains, sheets, and cushions, so nothing could see in. I don't know what the hell was out there, but it was sure as shit not our friends. About an hour had passed since we heard the calls. None of us had eaten. We don't think we would have tried. Probably for the best anyways, to help conserve our food. I stood up to go over to the bathroom when I felt a painful feeling in my gut. That hole, that disturbing sensation that told me I'd never see my friends again was back. Stronger than ever. It felt almost like I was sinking. We could hear scraping from outside the front door. I peeled back the sheet we had used to cover it just an inch. I first noticed the glint of empty beer cans, gleaming in what little light there was to catch. Something had drank the auspicious we'd left on the porch. I turned my vision up to scour the landscape. I could see the outline of a person, someone familiar, someone I knew. I covered it back up and retreated from the door. Kate and Crystal looked at me, wondering what I'd seen. As the lock started to shimmy and release, the door handle turned. I looked at them, almost unable to speak. I told them what I saw. It was heaven. A story written in 2021 in memory of Evan. Pacific Crest. The following is transcribed from a journal found by two hunters deep in the backcountry of Mount Hood National Park. September 8th. So very excited. I've been planning this trip for months, and tomorrow is finally the day. I've always wanted to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, and now I finally get my chance. A small part of it, anyway. Someday it would be cool to do the whole trail, all the way from Canada to Mexico down the west coast. The plan for this trip is to hike 45 miles from Barlow south to Elkton. It should take about 4 days. My mum agreed to drop me off and pick me up at the end of the trail, since it's only about an hour drive. This is the perfect way to end summer vacation before I go back to school, before the autumn semester. And since it's after Labor Day, the trails shouldn't be too crowded. Good thing OSU starts later than most schools. Just me and the woods for 4 days. Mum's a little nervous, but I know what I'm doing. I have more than enough food and water, sleeping bag, tent, map, compass. I'm all set. Hopefully I won't have to use my new rain gear. The forecast looks fantastic. September 9th. Today was a great day. One of those perfect late summer days where the sun is starting to hang low in the sky, but still warm enough to wear just shorts and a t-shirt. Mom cried a little when she dropped me off. Usually she isn't this emotional, but I get it. She's been pretty protective of her only son since Dad died a couple years ago. It's weird she's so worried, since it was her idea that I end my summer break to hike the trail. She did the same section last year, and said it was the best thing she's ever done. I set out on the trail and I only saw 2 people for the rest of the day. They were a couple, probably in their late 40s. They said they had just come from Elkton and the trail conditions were pretty good. It took them 3 days, but they said they were going at a pretty good pace, and joked that a young guy like me could probably do it in 2 if I really wanted to. After hiking for what I think was about 10 miles, I found a good place to pitch my tent, and now I'm in my sleeping bag alone in the middle of nowhere. I'm in heaven. September 10th. The weather has shifted a little. The forecast said that it would be sunny the whole time that I'm out here, and it was in the morning. But in the afternoon, a heavy fog set in. I ran into a few hikers coming the other way. People are so friendly out here. It's hard to determine how much ground I've covered, but I still like to feel I'm in a pretty good place. I'm rewarding myself for a long day of hiking with one of those Snickers bars I bought. September 11th. The fog still hasn't lifted. I thought that it might burn off by the afternoon, but it never did. I didn't see another hiker all day. This is supposed to be one of the most popular hikes in America, so it was weird to go a whole day without encountering one person. But it is a Wednesday and most schools have started back up, so it's a pleasant surprise to have the whole trail to myself. I'm a little surprised I haven't passed Highway 201 yet. Since I haven't crossed it yet, it means I'm a little behind schedule. The intersection of Highway 201 with the trail signifies that I'm about 20 miles from Elkton. Mum is picking me up tomorrow, and if I'm not there, she'll really worry. I'm going to have to really pick up the pace if I'm going to make it to Elkton by nightfall tomorrow. September 12th. This isn't good. I still haven't passed over Highway 201. That means I'm over 20 miles from Elkton. Mum's waiting there for me. She must be worried sick. I feel like the worst son in the world. Another day without seeing anyone. Yes, it is after the busy season, and yes, it is a weekday. But I figured I would have seen some other vacationers. Some other college students who hadn't started up again yet. But there was no one. If I ran into someone, at least I could ask them how far to the highway. Or if they had a GPS, I could figure out exactly where I was. I feel like such an idiot for not bringing a GPS. I've always felt that knowing exactly where you are takes some of the adventure out of it. How stupid could I be? How could there be no one on this trail? The fog still hasn't lifted. I need to ration my food a little better. I think I'm still 2 days out. September 13th. Oh man, what the hell? I ran all day today. At least as fast as I could with a 65-pound backpack and still no sign of the highway. Are there no other hikers on this trail? How can I go 3 days without seeing another soul? Also, the woods are quiet. Completely quiet. The first few days I heard birds chirping and insects buzzing, but today, nothing. I can hear every creak of every twig beneath my feet. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breath and pounding heart other than that. The fog is even heavier than it was before. I had to concentrate hard just to make sure I was still on the trail. And I still haven't crossed Highway 201. I took out my headlamp and kept going after nightfall, hoping that around each bend I would find my way to the highway. But no. I set up camp a little around 11. I'm going to get up at dawn and keep going. September 14th. I fucked up. I fucked up big time. I should have stopped last night when the sun went down. I'm so goddamn stupid. I lost the trail. I woke up this morning on a flat patch of dirt and there was no trail in sight. After breaking camp, I tried to find it, but I just went deeper into the woods. Shit. I was supposed to find Elkton 2 days ago, and now I'm lost. This is so basic, I can't believe I did it. You don't keep going through heavy woods at night. I'm so screwed. I need to stay calm. This is going to be fine. According to my map, if I keep heading south, I will eventually hit Highway 201. It cuts across the whole state. From there, I can get my bearings and find my way somewhere with a payphone, or someone whose cell phone I can borrow. Keep calm. It's going to be fine. September 15th. Run out of water. I filled up my bottle from a mud puddle. It's been drizzling a little. I don't have a filter or water purification tablets, and the water is muddy and gross, but better than nothing. Still no sign of the trail or the highway. September 16th. Walked south all day, no sign of Highway 201. I have a lighter and tried to start a fire. That's against the rules out here. You aren't supposed to have a fire unless you have a campground and a designated fire pit. But these are extreme circumstances. It didn't even matter anyway, everything is too damp. I couldn't find anything dry enough to use as kindling, and all the larger pieces of wood are soaked straight through. September 17th. The fog still hasn't lifted. I can't see more than a few feet in any direction. I can't get a fix on any land feature, and every tree looks the same. The moss is thick and covers everything. The air is heavy. It's so quiet, I keep hoping I'll hear the sound of cars driving in the distance, or at least a stream so I can get some clean water, but no such luck. I haven't seen a single deer, a chipmunk, even a bird in days. September 18th. Food is running low. Down to a handful of granola and a few string cheese sticks. No sign of Highway 201. Classes are starting today. I'm thinking of all my friends that are laughing and having fun back at school. September 19th. Moving south, I came to a patch of mud with boot prints in them. I almost jumped for joy. They must belong to a hunter or something, someone who would come out to the backcountry. I screamed for help at the top of my lungs. There was no response. Then I realized that the boot prints were my boot prints, or someone who has the exact same kind of boots as me. I have been keeping careful track with the compass. I've been moving south. I've only been moving south. There is no way I could be walking in circles. Has to be someone with the same kind of boots as me. There's no other explanation. But how did they get out here? Why haven't I hit the highway yet? I'm scared. Someone must be looking for me. I've been gone for so long, it's so far past when I'm supposed to meet my mum. There must be a search party. Either I'll find my way to the highway or they'll find me. I feel very weak. September 20th. No highway. The fog still hasn't lifted. Tried eating some berries from a bush, but they made me throw up. We'll have to start trying different kinds of leaves. Must eat something. September 23rd. I found a plant that hasn't made me sick. It's pretty disgusting, but when I eat leaves I don't throw up, and I can kind of feel my strength coming back. I don't know what it's called, but it's everywhere and pretty distinctive. I might be lost, but I don't think I'll starve. September 30th. I've been getting the sensation that I'm not alone. In the silence of the woods, every so often I'll hear something moving in the cloudy space around me. I'll yell out, but I'll hear nothing back. I hope it's just a deer, but I feel like I'm being watched. I have to keep it together. It's easy to get paranoid when you're alone like this. Keep it together, Kevin. October 3rd. I've been having the same dream every night. I wake up at home in bed, relieved that this whole ordeal had just been a dream. I go downstairs and my parents are there. My dad is still alive. My mum has made breakfast. There's a door that goes down to the basement of my house, but in real life my house doesn't have a basement. There are noises coming from down there. I ask my parents what they are and they just tell me not to worry, there's nothing down there. I open the door to investigate and all I see is darkness, a deep, endless darkness. I look down into it and become disoriented. Then I wake up, alone in my tent, still lost. October 5th. I found something today. I don't even know how to write this. I came over a small hill and something caught my eye. It seemed out of place, but in the thicket of the fog I couldn't tell what it was. I went to investigate, and if I wasn't holding it in my hands right now, I wouldn't believe it. It's a stuffed dog. For a child, a little terrier. It's in perfect condition. It isn't dirty or waterlogged or anything. It was just sitting there under a tree. The thing is, I had this dog. Or at least a dog like it when I was a kid. It is exactly the same as the one I carried with me everywhere I went when I was younger. How did it get out here? Everything in the woods is damp. How is this bone dry? I yelled out into the fog but got no response. Holding this makes me feel like a little kid again. I feel so vulnerable and small. I'm so tired and hungry. I just want to be home in bed, lying under the covers with a big cup of hot chocolate. Still no sign of the highway. October 16th. I woke up last night in the pitch blackness to the sound of my name being called by a man's voice in the darkness. Kevin. 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 At first I was frightened. I haven't heard another person's voice in so long, but I realized this must be the search party. I was so excited. I leaped out of my tent and cried out into the darkness, "Here I am!" But the voice kept yelling out, "Kevin! Kevin! I'm sorry, Kevin. This is the only way." I got scared and started throwing rocks into the darkness. The voice said again, "I'm sorry, Kevin. It's the only way. It'll all be over soon." I cried out, "What will be over soon?" The voice just said, "I'm sorry." I know I must have imagined this. The spookiest thing is the voice sounded just like my father. I'm worried I'm starting to lose my mind. October 22nd. I threw the compass away. It must be broken. I've been going south for so long, I should have crossed half a dozen highways by now and be nearly to California. The compass disappeared into the fog, and I heard it smack against a tree. Good riddance. October 25th. It's been raining, and I walked past some mud puddles. I filled my water puddles with the murky water and got a glimpse of my reflection. I looked gaunt and pale like a ghost. It almost felt like I was looking at someone else. My eyes have sunken deep into my face. In my reflection, I saw something moving behind me. I jerked around and there was nothing there. The feeling that I'm being watched is getting stronger. Every so often, I'll find myself yelling out into the fog, "Here I am! If you're out there, show yourself!" But all I get is silence. Not even an echo of my own voice. October 29th. The batteries in my headlamp are about to die. I haven't been using it much, but I'm kicking myself for not putting fresh batteries in before I left. The fog is so thick I can't see the stars or the moon at night. It's the darkest black I've ever seen, and now I don't even have my headlamp. I'm so scared. November 7th. I woke up this morning, and again, I'm not sure if I can trust my eyes anymore. Folded into the flap of my tent was a piece of construction paper. On it was a crude painting, obviously done by a small child. It took me a few moments to realize where I knew it from. I drew this. It's 3 stick figures. My dad, my mum, and me. There's a yellow sun in the corner. I painted this in kindergarten. I don't remember painting it, but I do remember that I hung it on the fridge until I was about 15. I was embarrassed that my parents still had it up when my friends came over, but they would laugh and say it was cute. What was it doing here? Who put it there? I was so terrified I tried to cry, but I'm so tired and weak and dehydrated I just couldn't. I tried to use the paper to start a fire, but the wood was too wet. November 18th. For the first time in weeks, the fog cleared a little, and what I saw was the most unsettling experience of my life. I came to an area of stones and boulders that I could see a few hundred yards ahead of me. At first, it was disorienting. I haven't been able to see beyond a few feet for so long. In the distance, I could barely make out a woman's figure. I yelled for her, but she made no sense. I scrambled to get closer, yelling frantically, and still no response. I was about 50 yards away when she turned around slowly. She had on a tattered black robe. Her hair was dark brown, long and wild with streaks of grey. She looked neither young nor old. The first thing I noticed was her smile. The corners of her mouth seemed to extend beyond the edges of her face, and her grin was full of sharp, jagged teeth. Her skin was grey and hung from her bones. She held up a hand as if to say, "Stop, you're close enough." I froze. My dreams of being rescued were over. Clearly this woman would not be my salvation. Her eyes were black and sunk deep into her skull as she stared at me. She spoke, if you can call it that. I saw her mouth move, but the words echoed in my mind like they were my own thoughts in a shrill and menacing timbre. She said,
"I've been expecting you. You'll do nicely."
I don't know what she was talking about, but I was too terrified to ask.
"You've had a long journey, but no need to worry. It'll all soon be over. Yes, you will soon be at rest."
I was ready to give up. I was tired and weak, and over the last few weeks, what little hope I had drained from my body. I asked her who she was, what she wanted from me. She threw her head back and laughed, a deep, mannish laugh that seemed to make the earth shake. It caused me to lose my balance and fall backwards.
"She was right about you. You are strong-willed. I like that. It will serve my purpose well."
Who was right?
"Why, your mother, of course. She and I have made a deal. You, my dear boy, have been offered as a sacrifice for his return. Your flesh will serve as payment, and come nightfall, payment shall be made."
For whose return?
"Your father, of course."
She turned and descended onto the rock she was perched on, disappearing behind it. I dropped my pack to chase after her. When I got there, she was gone. The sun is setting, and I'm sitting in my tent, and it must have been my imagination. I'm tired and dehydrated, and I haven't eaten in days, and none of that could have been real. I'm going to sleep, and when I wake up, I will keep looking for the highway, and when I find it, I'll go home. I'll go back to eating hot meals and sleeping in a bed. I'll go back to school next semester, hang out with my friends, and go to parties and talk to girls. Someday this whole ordeal will fade from my memory and feel like it was just a bad dream. Tomorrow I'll find the highway. And when I find the highway, I can go home.